Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we journey deep into the marble corridors of palaces that glitter by candlelight, where velvet curtains mask not just the echoes of royal proclamations, but also the soft squelch of something much more human. Picture it. Golden goblets, jewelled crowns, sumptuous feasts, and right in the middle of all this grandeur a very ornately carved wooden toilet. Because no matter how divine a monarch claimed to be, every last one had to use the bathroom, and someone had to help them do it. That someone, the groom of the stool, and they probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Don't forget to drop your location and the local time in the comments. I always love seeing where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin not with coronations or battlefield triumphs, but with a much quieter, if smellier, moment in history. Imagine the grand Tudor court, where opulence and discomfort mingled like perfumes and manure. The year is 1509, and Henry VIII is freshly crowned. Everyone knows the young king is full of vigour, ambition, and a fondness for fine wine. But few outside the palace realise there's one man he trusts above nearly all others. Not his chancellor, not his military commanders, not even his advisers in Parliament. No, that honour goes to a nobleman who follows the king not onto the battlefield, but into the bathroom. In a time before flushing toilets, before toilet paper, and certainly before personal privacy, relieving oneself was less a private act and more a performance. Inside the royal privy chamber, an opulent space decked with tapestries, soft cushions, and sometimes even a harpist, there sat a richly upholstered chair with a removable seat. Beneath it, a silver or pewter chamber pot awaited its kingly offering, and waiting close by, brush in hand, was the groom of the stool. His job was as clear as it was mortifying, to assist the king with wiping, washing, and whatever else was required during His Majesty's close stool sessions. And yet, here's the twist that history loves to play. This was one of the most prestigious positions in the English royal household. It's almost poetic, really. While courtiers plotted and gossiped in the gilded halls, one man quietly gained power by being closer to the king than anyone else. Physically, emotionally, politically. Historians still argue whether the role was originally intended as a political stepping stone or just a practical necessity. Either way, the groom of the stool quickly became an indispensable figure in the Tudor court, tasked not just with hygiene, but with handling sensitive paperwork, managing access to the king, and often serving as a trusted confidant. But let's rewind just a little further. Before Henry VIII's infamous reign, the title existed under his father, Henry VII. Back then, the role was primarily one of trust. Since the king's health, diet and bowels were considered matters of national security, the person monitoring those moments had to be absolutely reliable. And what better way to vet loyalty than by seeing who would willingly wipe your backside? As absurd as it sounds, the groom's duties weren't seen as degrading at all, quite the opposite. This was a job given to nobles, sons of earls and barons, who viewed it as a gateway to influence. One day you're fetching linen cloths and arranging a perfumed basin of water, and the next you're advising the king on who should govern Ireland. It helped that the groom of the stool had the monarch's undivided attention during unguarded moments, like mid-bowel movement, and it's hard to lie to someone who's holding your pants. Interestingly, the language used to describe the job danced delicately around its true nature. Official court records often mention the chamber, the privy, and the stool, but rarely describe exactly what took place there. A bit like modern job descriptions, really. Facilitates personal care sounds a lot nicer than wipes royal rear ends, and there were perks, enormous ones. The groom often received lavish gifts, estates, and income, plus the ability to influence appointments and royal decisions. He wasn't just a bathroom buddy, he was a gatekeeper to the king's inner sanctum. Foreign ambassadors sometimes bribed the groom in hopes he might whisper their agendas into the king's ear at just the right moment, say, while handing over a towel. Now, just to pause for a moment, imagine the sheer contrast. On one hand, a man in embroidered doublets handling matters of state. On the other, the same man, sleeves rolled, managing a royal defecation with all the gravity of a priest performing communion. There's a fine line between sacred and ridiculous, and the Tudor court loved to walk it. As for the stool itself, it wasn't your average wooden seat. The royal close stool was a marvel of craftsmanship, cushioned, lined with velvet and often monogrammed. Some even had carrying cases so it could follow the king wherever he travelled, on hunts, in carriages, even into battle encampments. Truly, the throne never stayed far from the throne. What's more fascinating is how this role reveals the sheer lack of personal privacy for monarchs of the era. Today, we clutch our phones and hope no one knocks on the bathroom door. But back then, the king's bodily functions were communal knowledge, studied like weather reports. If the king hadn't been in a few days, whispers would start among his physicians. Was he ill? Poisoned? Planning something? Planning. Courtiers kept track, and the groom kept logs. No pun intended. Of course, the role wasn't just about elimination. The groom also helped the king dress, undress, and bathe. He might carry letters or handle confidential notes. In many ways, he was a personal assistant, valet, secretary, and sanitation worker rolled into one, and in the brutal game of Tudor politics, being that close to the king was worth any amount of stink. And yet, there's something almost endearing about it. In an age obsessed with hierarchy and performance, the groom of the stool reminds us that even kings are quite literally human. They suffer constipation, they need help, they fart, and someone has to deal with it. There's one delightful fringe tidbit that occasionally floats through historical gossip, that some kings use their time on the stool to practice speeches, rehearse arguments, or compose poetry, out loud. Picture a nobleman nodding gravely as the king recites his sonnet to a background symphony of digestive noises. Whether true or not, it's exactly the kind of detail that makes history shimmer with absurd humanity. And while the role may seem outlandish, it wasn't unique to England. Other European courts had similar positions, though they varied in name and prestige. But no other nation quite institutionalised the relationship between bowel and bureaucracy like the Tudors did. It's worth noting that this was a time when plumbing barely existed, and odours were part of daily life. People perfumed their gloves, carried scented sachets, and sprinkled rose petals on the floors to mask the funk. In that world, the groom's presence wasn't just accepted, it was expected. Of course, not everyone was thrilled by the idea. New courtiers sometimes balked at the intimacy of the role. But once they saw the rewards, titles, lands, influence, the disgust often faded beneath ambition. A few even campaigned for the position, whispering their names to the right ears or cozying up to palace insiders. And so, in a time of beheadings, betrayals, and brutal court intrigue, the safest path to power wasn't always through strength or strategy. Sometimes it was through soft linen, warm water, and an unwavering ability to keep a straight face under the worst of smells. In the ever-turning carousel of Tudor drama, one figure rises from behind the embroidered curtain with surprising consistency: the groom of the stool. His emergence wasn't so much a thunderclap as a slow, sticky climb, awkwardly literal given the job description. But once the role was established under Henry VII, it took a firm and unexpected leap under his notorious son, Henry VIII. If there's any monarch who could elevate bathroom politics to the level of statecraft, it's the man who treated marriage like seasonal fashion. Henry VIII didn't just inherit the throne, he inherited the entire apparatus of royal intimacy. For a king whose appetites were legendary, food, women, power, it made perfect sense that he would surround himself with people who catered to every possible bodily need. Enter the groom of the stool, confidant, assistant, toilet handler, and, in a bizarre twist of fate, one of the most powerful men in England. During Henry VIII's reign, the role transformed from a matter of hygiene into a coveted political post. His grooms of the stool were not faceless servants. They were noblemen of considerable stature, with names like Sir Henry Norris, Sir William Compton, and Sir Anthony Denny. These were not men accustomed to fetching towels and bending the knee beside a commode. They were courtiers, landowners, and political players. But that's the strange thing about this job. Proximity to the king, even in his most vulnerable moments, became a potent currency. Sir Henry Norris, one of the early grooms under Henry VIII, began as a fairly typical noble. He was educated, well-connected, and politically ambitious. Being appointed groom of the stool vaulted him into the king's most private circle. He dined with Henry, travelled with him, laughed at his jokes, even the ones made mid-squat presumably, and more importantly he listened. the Groom became a repository for secrets, a sounding board for frustrations, and a filter through which much of the king's communication passed. But that intimacy came with risk. Norris, once so close to Henry that he was practically a shadow, fell from grace in a stomach-churning spiral. In 1536, amid the chaos of Anne Boleyn's downfall, Norris was accused of having an affair with the Queen. Historians still debate whether the charges were fabricated. Many believe they were, but the consequences were very real. Norris was beheaded. The man who once handled the king's most unmentionable business found himself silenced permanently, a reminder that getting close to power could mean hugging a guillotine. Yet the role endured. Henry VIII didn't eliminate the position after Norris's fall. In fact, he seemed to double down on it. The next grooms of the Stool, including Sir Anthony Denny, wielded even more influence. Denny, in particular, managed the king's access in his final years, essentially controlling who saw Henry and when. If Denny decided someone was unworthy of an audience, they simply didn't see the king. He was, in effect, a gatekeeper. Not bad for someone whose job began with a chamber pot and a linen cloth. It wasn't just Denny's political savvy that made him powerful. It was his timing. Henry's later years were riddled with illness, obesity, and paranoia. As the king's health deteriorated, so too did his ability to manage court affairs personally. Denny filled the vacuum, and thanks to his intimate knowledge of the king's condition, both mental and intestinal, he held a rare kind of power. It's said that in the days leading to Henry's death, Denny was among the few who knew the truth about his rapidly failing health. Even the king's own council was kept in the dark for a time. That kind of access was priceless. Historians still argue whether Denny was simply a loyal servant or a shrewd manipulator playing a long game. Either way, the result was the same. When Henry VIII died in 1547, the man who likely handed him his final towel also helped steer the political succession. The Groom of the Stool had officially transcended the toilet to enter the throne room of English politics. And here's a delicious little fringe tidbit. During Henry's reign, the Groom was also occasionally tasked with keeping the king's bowels on schedule. That meant managing his diet, monitoring his digestion and, brace yourself, recording his outputs. Yes, somewhere, there existed written records of the king's bowel movements, perhaps logged in a fine leather-bound volume with an elegant quill. While no such diary has survived, the practice of medical journaling among royals was well documented. And let's face it, Henry wasn't exactly subtle when it came to his body. Meanwhile, the broader Tudor court watched all this with fascination and envy. To be Groom of the Stool wasn't just a job, it was a golden key. Nobles who might otherwise spend years trying to catch the king's eye could find themselves leapfrogged by a man with the courage and the cloth to squat by the monarch's side. Resentment bubbled under the surface naturally. Some courtiers mocked the position in private, but many more quietly lobbied for it, currying favour with whispers and wine, hoping to one day be trusted with the stool. There's an old courtly saying, "He who holds the chamber pot holds the crown." Okay, no, there isn't, but there should be. But the power dynamics were especially striking during moments of political upheaval. When Henry annulled his marriage to Catherine of Aragon and married Anne Boleyn, his groom was right there, privy to every anxious rant and sleepless night. When Anne miscarried, when Jane Seymour died in childbirth, when Henry's ulcers flared and his moods darkened, always the groom was near. The role offered a front-row seat to every tragedy, every triumph, and every indigestion-induced meltdown. And let's not pretend this intimacy was purely professional. Being present during these moments built a bond. The king might confide in his groom things he would never say aloud to advisers or wives. In a world where spies and betrayals lurked behind every arras, a groom's loyalty was not just valuable, it was vital. Betrayals like Norris's, if they even were betrayals, were rare precisely because most grooms understood the stakes. One wrong move, one misplaced whisper, and you'd go from wielding towels to losing your head. Of course, this setup had its critics. Some historians argue that the very existence of such a position highlights how absurdly hierarchical the Tudor world was. That someone could rise to national prominence by managing royal bathroom affairs is, to modern eyes, either laughable or tragic, or both. Others defend the role as a necessary adaptation to a world without modern hygiene, where cleanliness and discretion were tightly linked to health and governance. And speaking of health, remember, This was an age where constipation wasn't just uncomfortable, it was life-threatening. Monarchs, like many aristocrats, consumed heavy meat-laden diets. Vegetables were suspicious, exercise was minimal, baths were rare. Medical theories of the day believed that bad humours needed to be expelled regularly, or else illness would fester. The groom of the stool thus played a role not just in comfort, but in preventive healthcare. Some even administered mild enemas or arranged leech treatments, tasks that blurred the line between valet and physician. It's no wonder that foreign dignitaries were often baffled by the groom's prominence. Letters from Spanish and Venetian ambassadors occasionally mention the position with a mix of fascination and thinly veiled horror. "In your England," one remarked, "the man who wipes the king becomes a minister." And he wasn't wrong. Yet perhaps the most surreal element of all is how normalised the position became within English court culture. For nearly 2 centuries it was a standard role, its bizarre functions cloaked in ceremonial importance. People trained for it. Parents aspired to it for their sons. And those who held the post often went on to even greater political power, serving in the Privy Council or becoming key advisors to future monarchs. Still, no amount of perfume or velvet can completely disguise the role's earthy reality. Behind the titles, the honours, and the elaborate language, the groom of the stool was ultimately the man who helped the king poop. It's a job that straddles the line between grotesque and glorious, humiliating and heroic. And in Henry VIII's world, where loyalty was everything and privacy was a myth, it might just have been the most honest role of them all. So the next time you think politics is dirty business, remember Henry's court. Remember the groom standing quietly with basin in hand, ready to serve not just his monarch, but the machinery of the state itself, one flush at a time. As the Tudor dynasty lumbered forward with all the grace of a gouty stag, the role of the groom of the stool continued to balloon in importance. And nowhere is that more obvious than during the reign of Henry VIII, whose court was, to be perfectly honest, less a government and more a reality show with better wigs. In this glittering theatre of power, whispers and waistlines, the groom remained a constant fixture, diligent, discreet, and rarely acknowledged in public, despite wielding behind-the-scenes influence that would make a modern-day chief of staff blink in disbelief. Henry VIII had a thing for loyalty, obsessively so. Perhaps it stemmed from the treachery he perceived in others, or perhaps from the cold comfort of knowing that while his wives might be plotting, at least the man scrubbing his backside wasn't. Sir Anthony Denny, one of the last grooms of Henry's reign, became something of a confidant counsellor hybrid. He not only managed the king's physical relief, but also handled his correspondence, acted as a gatekeeper to visitors, and whispered strategic suggestions into the king's ear in moments when few others dared interrupt. The intimacy between king and groom wasn't forged overnight. It was built slowly, in soft exchanges between layers of linen, over the dull clang of chamber pots being replaced and rinsed. Think of it as medieval male bonding, with fewer swords and more soap. Over time, these men became the king's barometers for honesty. Unlike the flattery that flowed like wine in the court's grand halls, the groom's words carried an odd, grounded weight. There's something about seeing someone at their most vulnerable that tends to strip away artifice. By the time Denny entered the picture, Henry's body had begun its sad descent. He was bloated, chronically ill, and afflicted with a famously festering leg ulcer that left him in constant agony. The king spent much of his later life seated, sometimes on a throne, sometimes on his ornately padded close stool. The lines blurred. Denny, ever loyal, was one of the few who didn't shy away. He was there to bathe the king's sores, to help him dress, to clean up after messy accidents that were far from dignified. And yet, instead of diminishing him, this devotion elevated Denny. Henry, increasingly paranoid and dependent, began to trust Denny with tasks once reserved for higher officials. It was Denny who eventually told the dying monarch that his end was near, gently, privately, and without spectacle. The king, according to some accounts, simply nodded. The one man allowed to speak so plainly to a divine ruler was the one who had handled him at his most human. Meanwhile, courtiers jostled for position in the growing vacuum of power. Access to the king was everything, and Denny controlled that access like a bouncer at the world's most exclusive club. Ministers who once wielded authority found themselves knocking, sometimes literally, on the groom's door. and whether they were admitted depended less on their titles and more on their standing with the man who handled the towels. It was around this time that the position achieved what we might call peak paradox, immense political clout wrapped in the least glamorous duties imaginable. To outsiders, the contradiction was baffling. How could someone with such scatological responsibilities be entrusted with state secrets? And yet, that was the point. The groom saw the king without his armour, both literal and figurative. In a world obsessed with masks and manners, the groom witnessed the unfiltered monarch. And that honesty, rare as gold, was its own form of power. The king's other advisers may have worn richer robes, but they couldn't predict the king's mood by the texture of his morning movement. That's not hyperbole. Some grooms reportedly used this information to decide whether or not to bring up sensitive topics. If the king had a good bowel day, it was time to talk taxes. If not, perhaps best to steer clear. It wasn't all whispers and porcelain, though. Grooms were also custodians of order in the privy chamber, the section of the palace reserved for the king's personal life. That meant overseeing the movement of furniture, supervising other servants, even arranging the king's meals and music. The privy chamber was the heart of royal domestic life, and the groom was its pulse. Their roles straddled public and private, ceremony and sanitation. But it wasn't without its dangers. The closer one stood to the throne, the easier it was to fall from grace. Court life was a cauldron of jealousy, and few escaped unscathed. Whispers could quickly become accusations, and accusations, especially of disloyalty, could lead to the tower. Even a groom who had faithfully served for decades might find himself cast aside if the political winds shifted. Take Sir Henry Norris, for example. His fate was not unique in being tragic, but it was exceptional in its irony. After years of faithful service, Norris was accused, likely falsely, of adultery with Queen Anne Boleyn. Henry's fury was swift and surgical. Despite a lack of credible evidence, Norris was arrested, tried, and executed. His crime? Being close enough to the Queen to raise suspicion, and perhaps too loyal to her cause. The same proximity that once made him powerful had made him vulnerable. Historians continue to debate the truth of Norris's guilt. Some argue it was a political setup, orchestrated to remove Anne Boleyn and reset the chessboard. Others believe that Norris may have indeed sympathised with the Queen, or at least failed to report court gossip to the king. Either way, his head ended up on the block, a chilling reminder of how intimacy could be as dangerous as treason. But the role endured. New grooms stepped in, wiser and warier. The position remained one of silent strength, never officially exalted, always quietly respected. It wasn't the kind of job that earned you ballads or stained-glass tributes, but in the shadowy corners of court life it was understood. The groom of the stool mattered. A lesser-known fringe tidbit comes from a later document listing the groom's formal duties. It reads, almost quaintly, that he must keep the chamber clean, sweet and wholesome. Sweet. In an age before plumbing, that likely required a great deal of dried herbs, rose petals and divine tolerance. One wonders if there was a favourite scent, perhaps lavender, or if the grooms just relied on opening the windows and praying for a breeze. While the exact mechanics of each groom's work varied depending on the monarch, the essentials remained the same. Attend to the king's calls of nature, ensure his comfort, and manage the fine choreography of royal excretion. It's strange to think how many of history's turning points may have been influenced by the mood of a constipated king, but given how central digestion was to health, and health to power, it's entirely plausible. There's even suggestion in some diaries and letters that kings discussed matters of state while on the stool. It may sound absurd, but consider the privacy. There, in a chamber buffered by velvet drapes and loyal guards, away from the scrutiny of court, a king might speak his mind more freely. The groom would listen, not just to commands, but to musings, complaints, and unfiltered thoughts, and then he'd act accordingly, filtering requests, adjusting schedules, and managing courtly tensions with the subtlety of a seasoned diplomat. It's no wonder the role left ripples in the wider political pond. Ambassadors often tried to cosy up to the groom, knowing that flattery or gifts might open diplomatic doors. Some even included the groom in their correspondence, thanking him for arranging meetings or dropping hints to the monarch. The chamber pot, it seemed, was as much a portal to policy as Parliament. What the position lacked in dignity, it made up for in durability. The groom of the stool endured as a symbol of paradox. a job too intimate to be prestigious and too prestigious to ignore. And perhaps that's why it fascinates us today. It's a reminder that even the most powerful men in history were ultimately mortal, bound by biology and humbled by their own insides. That behind the silken sceptres was always the same universal truth: everyone poops. In a world built on rigid social hierarchies and centuries-old customs, there's something almost gleefully rebellious about the idea that one of the most intimate royal positions, both physically and politically, was filled by someone wiping royal rears. Yet the role of the Groom of the Stool continued to defy expectation. As England moved beyond the Tudor period into the slightly more powdered wigs of the early Stuart dynasty, the job didn't just survive, it evolved. Enter the 17th century, with its shift towards centralised governance, religious turbulence, and emerging Enlightenment ideas. Despite these philosophical upgrades, bodily functions hadn't become any more glamorous. Monarchs still needed help when nature called, and the Groom of the Stool was still standing by, ready with perfumed cloths and an impeccable poker face. What's particularly bizarre is that by this time, the position was typically held by men of increasingly high social standing. The grooms weren't just nobles, they were nobles of serious consequence. They were often chosen from among the barons or earls, individuals with land, titles and political aspirations. The role was no longer just an intimate post, it had fully matured into a springboard for greater political influence. Take Hugh Dennis, for example, who served under both Henry VII and briefly under Henry VIII. Though a little earlier than the Stuarts, he perfectly illustrates how the role blurred the lines between sanitation and statecraft. Dennis wasn't just a valet with a sponge, he managed royal finances and controlled access to the king. Historians still argue whether his influence over financial decisions was formal or simply a byproduct of his proximity. Either way, the Treasury noticed, by the time we reach James I of England, James VI of Scotland, the groom's job had become embedded in the royal apparatus. James, famously known for his flamboyant personality, literary interests and rather frank demeanour, maintained the tradition without much fanfare. He didn't balk at the idea of a nobleman handling his toileting, in fact he expected it. This was a monarch who delighted in banter and had little regard for false modesty. The Groom of the Stool continued to occupy a vital space in the court, albeit with slightly more lace and ruffles. But this brings us to an odd contradiction. How could such a grotesque-sounding job remain a symbol of elite trustworthiness for so long? The answer lies in the way the role straddled both personal service and political function. The groom had access not just to the king's bathroom but to his bedroom, dressing chamber and daily routines. He was often the first to see the monarch in the morning and the last to bid him good night. That kind of routine, repetitive contact forged deep loyalty and offered unrivaled opportunities for influence. This led to some grooms being appointed as personal confidants and even informal advisors on domestic policy. Because the king might grumble about Parliament while being laced into his doublet, or muse about war strategies between bites of roast capon, the groom became a trusted ear. He absorbed information constantly, and better yet, he could deliver it gently back to the king, shaped in soothing tones and framed with respectful suggestions. There's a fringe tidbit from James I's reign that suggests one groom, possibly John Murray, who later became Earl of Annandale, once tried to influence a land grant by presenting a petition during a grooming session. Whether it was handed over before or after wiping duties is mercifully unclear. But the story reveals just how brazenly political the role had become. At the same time, cleanliness, or the lack thereof, remained an ever-present concern. While the elite began experimenting with bathing rituals and scented waters, full-body hygiene was still rare. The groom's responsibilities included overseeing not just the toilet but the entire bodily upkeep of the monarch. This might involve trimming nails, assisting with shaving, or ensuring the royal undergarments were properly aired. If it seems a bit excessive, remember that monarchs were often viewed as semi-divine beings. Any touch, whether wiping or washing, had to be done with the reverence of a religious ritual. In this environment, the groom was expected to maintain a unique balance: absolute discretion and unwavering attentiveness. The chamber remained sacred, not for its religious importance, but because it was where the mask slipped. It's no exaggeration to say the groom saw the king more truly than anyone else, not in robes, not in armour, not in proclamation, but in flesh and need. And yet, by the late Stuart period, the tide of privacy was beginning to change. The Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and dignity began influencing perceptions of bodily autonomy. The growing middle class, influenced by Puritan values and later Georgian propriety, started to see open toileting as vulgar, even unseemly. Royalty, always a few decades behind in social trends, didn't immediately adapt. But cracks were forming. Historians still debate whether this cultural shift began in earnest during the reign of Charles II, the so-called Merry Monarch, who returned from exile with a fondness for French fashion, scientific curiosity, and an alarmingly active personal life. Charles reportedly kept a tight circle of male favourites around him, many of whom served in his private apartments. Some suggest that the groom's role under Charles began to transition from toiletry assistants to something closer to personal secretary. The wiping, that became someone else's job, perhaps delegated further down the household hierarchy, to yeomen or valets less likely to end up in portraits. Still, the office hadn't yet faded. Even as the role evolved, it retained ceremonial prestige. Being named Groom of the Stool was a mark of favour, proof that the monarch trusted you with not only his person, but his secrets, his frustrations, and his plans. The symbolism remained, even if the soap was now metaphorical. It's worth pausing to examine the tools of the trade, because, were they lavish? The close stool, still the centrepiece of the job, had evolved from a padded box with a bowl into an elaborate piece of furniture. Some were disguised as ordinary chairs, fitted with embroidered cushions and lined with perfumed fabric. Others folded into travel cases, allowing the monarch to relieve himself in relative comfort even on the battlefield. Rumour has it that one royal stool was inlaid with mother-of-pearl and had gilded hinges. Subtlety was not the aim. Alongside the stool, grooms kept a range of accessories: monogrammed linen cloths, scented vinegar for washing, bowls of warm rose water, and embroidered hand towels. Each item had its place, its ritual, its protocol. Wiping the monarch wasn't a slapdash affair. It was a sequence of gestures meant to soothe, cleanse, and affirm the divine dignity of the crown. That the act involved feces didn't diminish its ceremonial weight. If anything, it enhanced the symbolism. The king, though chosen by God, still needed help being clean. And the grooms weren't just passive servants. They had to be skilled in reading moods, managing egos, and interpreting half-spoken commands. They knew when to speak, when to remain silent, and when to step back. Quietly, elegantly, with a bow. Some even doubled as spies for the monarch, reporting gossip and court movements with the precision of trained informants. It was surveillance with a sweet scent of lavender and just a hint of, well, you know. One particularly odd anecdote from this era involves a foreign visitor to the English court who was scandalised to learn that the king's groom had seen him fully naked and spoken to him whilst he did sit upon the chair. To continental courtiers still obsessed with layers of formality, this intimacy was shocking. But in England, it was part of the charm. The groom's role was both ridiculous and revered, a walking contradiction clad in lace, and yet, for all its power, the position remained precarious. A groom who overstepped could quickly find himself dismissed, or worse. It was a fine line between trusted servant and political liability. The role demanded a monkish restraint, a politician's memory, and the patience of a saint, and in return, influence, proximity, and the quiet knowledge that you, more than anyone else, truly knew the king. As the curtain drew closer on the 17th century, the throne had begun to change, but the stool still sat in the corner of every palace, waiting. Waiting for the next monarch, the next whisper, the next quiet act of service that held the monarchy together, not with proclamations, but with patience and towels. By now, the image of the groom of the stool has fully settled into its peculiar place in royal law. A man of noble birth attending to the most undignified, yet oddly revered corner of the monarchy. And it wasn't all symbolism and political leverage. This was a practical job with practical tools. So let's get up close, but not too close, and personal with the literal nuts and bolts of the role. It's time to peer into the plush, perfumed, and shockingly intricate world of the royal restroom. First, the centrepiece, the close stool. This wasn't your average chamber pot hidden behind a curtain. The royal stool was frankly a marvel. Fashioned from mahogany or oak, and often upholstered with velvet or brocade, it resembled an elegant armchair more than anything designed for waste. It had a removable padded seat, under which sat a chamber pot made of pewter, silver, or sometimes porcelain. The entire apparatus was housed in a wooden case, sometimes with doors, handles, or even drawers, because heaven forbid the king be uncomfortable while evacuating. In fact, royal close stools were often custom designed, matching the aesthetics of the royal apartments. Some were so finely made that, if you didn't know their purpose, you might assume they were just fancy furniture. One stool reportedly featured gold embroidery and was lined with crimson damask. Another had tassels so ornate they could be mistaken for ceremonial regalia. And because nothing said monarch-like mobility, the stool was built to travel. It was collapsible, easily carried by servants, and could be unpacked and assembled wherever the king found himself in need, be it at court, on the hunt, or in the field. But a throne is only as good as its accessories. That brings us to the accompanying kit, a collection of items known euphemistically as necessary things, chief among them were the linen cloths. These were not reused rags or humble washcloths. They were fine pieces of bleached linen, sometimes scented with herbs or rosewater, and laundered to softness. The groom would typically warm the cloth before presenting it, ensuring the king experienced comfort even in his most unglamorous moments. Washing bowls, too, were designed for elegance. Crafted from silver or polished brass, they held warm water infused with petals or mint, used to cleanse and refresh. These basins were set beside the stool, ready at a moment's notice, and maintained with such fastidiousness that even a speck of dust might have been considered a grave oversight. Alongside the bowls were towels, again embroidered and monogrammed, used to gently pat the royal posterior dry. Interestingly, while most of the cloths were washed and reused, a few were reportedly burned after use during times of illness, particularly in later centuries when germ theory began to whisper its truths into medical circles. Until then, the prevailing belief was in bad humours and miasmas, foul smells that were thought to carry disease. To combat this, grooms often carried pouches of lavender, rosemary, or vinegar-soaked cloths to mask the odours and cleanse the air. And speaking of cleansing, one tool in the groom's arsenal deserves special attention. The bordaloo. This was a small canoe-shaped chamber pot, usually for women but occasionally adapted for royal use. Designed to be discreet and portable, it could be slipped under robes or used in carriages. Though not part of the traditional stool ensemble, it exemplified the ingenuity of the era in making the unavoidable act of relieving oneself as elegant as humanly possible. But no matter how many silk ribbons or gold leaf carvings adorned these tools, the core duty remained unavoidably personal. The groom needed to be prepared for anything, from gentle assistance to emergency interventions. Digestive upsets were common in an age of heavy meats, minimal vegetables, and questionable hygiene. Kings often indulged in excess, and their bodies responded in kind. There were no tums, no Imodium, just a loyal groom, a basin, and a prayer. This meant the groom had to be something of an amateur physician. He was expected to monitor the king's output, its frequency, consistency, colour, and report any abnormalities to the royal doctor. One can only imagine the coded language that might have been used in these discussions. His Majesty's disposition was more fluid than usual, perhaps, or there was a noticeable lack of regularity in the royal temperament. There's a quirky tidbit from the reign of William III suggesting that his groom once advised the king to eat fewer pickled herring and more figs. Why? To ease digestion, of course, and though that may sound like idle kitchen gossip, it reflects the broader responsibility the groom held, not just to clean, but to care. His job was to maintain the monarch's comfort, dignity, and, by extension, the kingdom's stability. The groom was also expected to know the king's schedule intimately. He would plan around meals, meetings, and court ceremonies to ensure that private time was available and secure. Disruptions were rare but not impossible. There are tales, likely embellished by time and imagination, of grooms ushering intruders out mid-session with a furious whisper, or shielding the king from prying eyes with their own bodies. True or not, the fact that such stories exist speaks to the strange reverence surrounding the role, but perhaps the strangest thing of all is that the groom was never mocked publicly. Satire targeted bishops, generals, even the monarch himself, but rarely the groom. Maybe it was fear of his influence, of his secrets, or maybe it was respect. After all, who else saw the king in such truth? Who else wiped away the excesses of power day after day without ever asking for applause? Still, behind closed doors, court life was rife with speculation. Was the groom merely a servant? Or was he a puppet master in linen gloves? Ambassadors speculated, ministers grumbled, and playwrights winked at the absurdity of it all. And yet the groom remained silent. That was part of the job too. Absolute, unbreakable discretion. The royal household was built like an onion, layer upon layer of ceremony, etiquette, and function. At its heart, closest to the core, stood the groom of the stool. He didn't just know where the bodies were buried. He knew what had passed through them. Another curious artifact from this world is the stool ledger, an unofficial term used by some historians for lists kept by grooms noting times, complaints, or peculiarities. While no actual ledger has ever been displayed publicly, references in letters and memoirs suggest such logs may have existed. These wouldn't have been crass recordings, but discreet medical notes passed quietly to the physician, or apothecary. Consider the implications. Entire political decisions may have hinged on the king's digestive health. A constipated king might delay a meeting. A queasy monarch might snap at a foreign envoy. A good groom learned to read the signs and adjust the schedule. In this way, the groom became part astrologer, part counsellor, and part janitor. A one-man court of bodily logistics. Even travel arrangements took the groom into account. When the king went on progress, a kind of royal road trip through the kingdom, the groom went with him, often arriving ahead to ensure accommodations included a properly prepared privy chamber. At times, that meant overseeing the construction of a temporary stool station in a manor house, or arranging for portable stools to be brought in. And yes, that included making sure the water was warm and the linens folded just so. But all of this, every bowl, every cloth, every whispered consultation, was done behind the scenes. There were no grand announcements. The groom's name appeared in court records, but rarely in headlines. His power was the quiet kind, threaded through routine and ritual, never flaunted. And as absurd as it may seem, perhaps that's the real legacy of the groom of the stool. A reminder that the most personal private acts can carry immense political weight. That in the swirl of empire, diplomacy and ceremony, someone still has to scrub the chair and fold the towels, and sometimes, just sometimes, that someone ends up shaping history. If you were to step into a Tudor or Stuart royal chamber expecting solitude and silence, you'd be sorely mistaken, and probably startled by how many courtiers loitered around. One of the enduring myths of monarchy is that kings and queens lived lives of privacy, wrapped in mystery behind velvet drapes. But in truth, privacy was not only rare, it was practically non-existent, and nowhere was this more hilariously evident than in the lavatorial habits of monarchs. To modern sensibilities, the idea of using the toilet in front of someone else, let alone being assisted, is a recipe for eternal mortification. But in early modern England, such behaviour was not just acceptable, it was a matter of custom, ceremony, and social order. The royal body was public property, both politically and physically. Its functions were not hidden away but managed in full view of trusted staff, and the groom of the stool stood right at the intersection of bodily necessity and regal dignity. For most people, a toilet is a place of retreat, a sanctuary of solitude. But for a Tudor king it was yet another stage. The stool itself was placed in the privy chamber, a misnamed location that was anything but private. This room wasn't a bathroom in the modern sense. It was a multi-purpose living space where the king dressed, consulted, and sometimes, yes, relieved himself. The groom was always close by, and at least one other valet or yeoman might be within earshot, ready to assist or fetch items on command. This total lack of privacy may seem bizarre, even grotesque, but within the cultural context of the time, it was completely logical. Monarchs were believed to be semi-divine, chosen by God, their bodies imbued with spiritual and political power. That body needed to be managed with reverence and, paradoxically, communal care. The groom's presence wasn't a sign of servitude. It was a symbol of trust, a reminder that the king need never be alone, even in his most human moments. The broader court reflected this ethos. Nobles were frequently jostling for the chance to help the monarch dress, serve meals, or attend to bedtime rituals. These were coveted honours. Being close to the royal body meant access, favour, and often advancement. It also meant witnessing things most people would rather forget. Open sores, bad breath, the occasional unseemly accident. But to serve the body was to serve the crown. It was even considered a mark of intimacy to be allowed into the king's bathing routine. The groom of the stool often participated in or oversaw royal bathing, which was itself a spectacle. A wooden tub lined with linens would be set up in the royal apartments. Perfumed oils, warm water and herbal poultices were prepared. Musicians might play softly, and the groom, alongside a select few attendants, would assist the king into the tub, sponge him down and dry him with monogrammed towels. There was no bubble bath, no candles. But there was an almost monastic seriousness to the affair, because the king's cleanliness was a reflection of his moral purity. But while the groom operated within this surreal framework of openness, there were still rules. Protocol dictated specific gestures, phrases and behaviours. The groom wasn't allowed to speak unless spoken to during certain moments, and eye contact was discouraged at particular stages of the ritual. It was an oddly choreographed dance between reverence and practicality. A wrong move, a mistimed cough, a misplaced cloth could result in public embarrassment or even demotion. One especially fringe yet amusing tidbit is that some monarchs, during their more constipated days, would hold entire informal meetings while seated on the stool. These sessions, as they were called, were taken quite literally by courtiers, who would gather discreetly in the room and take turns delivering updates or requests. It wasn't unusual for policies to be discussed, petitions granted, or even military matters decided while the king was doing his business. If anything, the stool became an unofficial desk, albeit one with a pot under it. To make this scenario even more surreal, some close stools were equipped with small writing surfaces, or the groom might hold a tray with ink, quills and documents. So, while one hand managed the logistics of hygiene, the other passed along decrees. It was multitasking in the most royal and ridiculous fashion. Still, it would be unfair to reduce the groom's work to mere bathroom duty. He was, by all practical measures, a lifestyle manager. He coordinated the king's wardrobe, prepared the royal bedchamber, and communicated with other departments of the household. His duties included organising the king's grooming supplies from combs to dental scrapers and ensuring His Majesty's undershirts were clean and warm. One misstep, say a cold towel or a missing handkerchief, could throw off the royal mood for hours, even days. So it wasn't surprising that the groom became a kind of barometer for the court. If the groom seemed cheerful, it meant the king was well. If he was tense, something was brewing. Foreign diplomats knew this, and some even attempted to bribe or befriend the groom to get inside information. Whether or not those bribes ever worked is debatable, but the attempt alone demonstrates how seriously the role was taken, even by outsiders. This deeply communal attitude toward bodily functions wasn't just reserved for monarchs either. In noble households across England, similar arrangements existed. Aristocrats often had their own personal servants to assist with toileting, bathing and grooming. Bathrooms as we know them were centuries away. Human needs were met wherever they could be managed with some degree of discretion and comfort. The general public, however, lived quite differently. For most people in Tudor and Stuart England, relieving oneself meant heading to a garden corner, an alleyway, or a communal privy. Hygiene was rudimentary. Chamber pots were emptied into the streets. Smells were a constant companion. And yet, in the royal court, the act of defecation was transformed into a ritual of such exaggerated dignity that it almost became majestic. But as ridiculous as it sounds, there was logic behind it. The king's body was tied to the health of the nation. If he was sick, the kingdom trembled. If he died, the entire political order shifted. So yes, his bowel movements mattered. They were recorded, interpreted, and sometimes even prayed over. The groom of the stool became a kind of human early warning system for royal health. There's a record of one groom quietly alerting a physician after noticing blood in the chamber pot. That observation may have saved the monarch's life, or at least bought him time. Such details were not casually discussed, but they were documented and acted upon with the urgency of a national emergency. Historians still argue whether this open approach to bodily functions was a sign of practical necessity or a warped form of aristocratic vanity. Was it simply that people didn't know better? Or was the royal household creating a theatre out of necessity, elevating even the mundane into a kind of divine performance? Either way, the result was a culture that viewed bodily exposure not as humiliation, but as service. The groom didn't degrade the monarch, he validated him. Of course, not every monarch embraced this openness with equal enthusiasm. Some, like Henry VIII, leaned into it with theatrical flair. Others, like Charles I, were more reserved, limiting access and shifting parts of the routine to lower-ranking servants. These subtle shifts mark the beginning of a slow cultural transformation, one that would eventually reintroduce the notion of privacy to royal life. But during the height of the groom's power, privacy was a luxury that even kings didn't demand. In fact, the idea of complete privacy was almost alien. The word itself, privacy, was rarely used in its modern sense. It meant more of a private life in terms of family and household, not isolation or solitude. Kings were expected to live in the presence of others, always available, always observed, always on. So in the glow of candlelight and the rustle of silk curtains, the groom of the stool did his work. He folded towels, held basins, listened to whispers, and kept his eyes lowered. He stood as a pillar of quiet loyalty in a court where every glance could be a weapon, every word a trap. And he did it all while knowing that the next moment could involve fetching a scented cloth, or offering political counsel that would shape the fate of England. Because in a world that celebrated grandeur and denied modesty, one man was always there to ensure that even the king's most basic needs were met with dignity. Behind every polished ceremony of monarchy, every grand feast and whispered counsel, there churned a river of secrets, often smelly, occasionally scandalous, and sometimes born in the quiet moments behind the velvet curtain. The groom of the stool, though officially a servant, stood like a sentinel at the crossroads of royal privacy and political plotting. And as history likes to remind us, whenever power accumulates in the shadows, scandal is never far behind. The most whispered about chapters of this role were rarely written down, but court gossip, private letters, and the occasional diary have left tantalizing clues about just how influential and vulnerable these grooms could be. For every groom who rose to dizzying heights of influence, there was one who fell from grace in a splatter of betrayal, accusation, or quiet disgrace. Consider the case of Sir Henry Norris, whom we've met before, a man who began as groom of the stool under Henry VIII and ended his career with his head on a spike. Norris was a trusted servant, a loyal courtier, and by most accounts an honest man. But in 1536 he was accused of having an affair with Queen Anne Boleyn. Whether the charges were true or, as many historians believe, a convenient fiction used to eliminate Anne and those close to her, Norris paid the ultimate price. In a grim irony, the man trusted to attend to the king's most vulnerable moments became a symbol of royal suspicion and fatal betrayal. The scandal rocked the court. Whispers flew through the palace halls like crows in a storm. If even the groom of the stool could fall, no one was safe. Some began to see the role not just as an honour, but as a danger, like sitting atop a barrel of gunpowder while lighting the king's candle. And Norris wasn't the only one caught in the swirl of scandal. Throughout the Tudor and early Stuart periods, grooms were occasionally accused of accepting bribes, leaking information, or even manipulating access to the king. Though not all of these claims were substantiated, the fact that such accusations were possible speaks volumes. The groom's proximity to the monarch made him a target, not just for enemies, but for desperate allies too. Access was everything. To speak with the king, to present a petition, to request favour, these all required navigating the labyrinth of court protocol. But the groom could, in theory, bypass that labyrinth. He could whisper a name during a morning dressing. He could slip a letter into the king's hand during a quiet moment. He could suggest that perhaps the Earl of so-and-so might not be entirely trustworthy, all while folding towels and straightening bed linens. That kind of informal power was both priceless and perilous. Some grooms used it wisely, forging alliances, advancing the careers of family and friends, or gently influencing policy. Others may have pushed too far, whispering in the wrong ear or making the wrong enemy. In a court where information was currency, the groom was sitting on a fortune. There are even scattered tales, though more rumour than fact, that grooms were used as pawns in larger political games. Rival factions at court might try to insert their own candidate into the role, knowing that whoever held the stool held the ear of the king. In one particularly murky episode during the reign of James I, a courtier named Robert Carr rose from humble beginnings to become the king's favourite. Though not officially the groom of the stool, Carr was so close to James that some of the groom's duties were said to be absorbed into his daily interactions. He eventually became Viscount Rochester, and later Earl of Somerset, titles that came with great power and inevitably scandal. Carr's downfall was worthy of a Shakespearean tragedy. He and his wife, Frances Howard, were implicated in the poisoning of Sir Thomas Overbury. a rival who had opposed their marriage. The scandal consumed the court and led to Carr's imprisonment. Though the connection to the groom's position was indirect, the story underscores a simple truth. When you're close to the crown, you're always one misstep away from catastrophe. Not all scandals involved high treason or murder. Some were simpler, more human, a misplaced letter, a personal slight, a moment of weakness. In one 17th century account, a groom was quietly dismissed after it was discovered he had sold access to foreign envoys, essentially charging bribes in exchange for softening the king's mood before meetings. The amounts were modest, the consequences relatively minor, but the message was clear: even loyalty has its limits. Then there were the cases lost to history, episodes we can only guess at from hints and gaps in the record. A sudden change in staff, a hasty promotion, or a cryptic comment in a courtier's diary. "He who handled the linen has vanished," one nobleman wrote in 1605, offering no further explanation. Did the groom fall out of favour? Was he caught in a scandal? Or was he simply tired of holding the chamber pot? Of course, scandal didn't always mean wrongdoing. Sometimes it meant being too close, too visible, too indispensable. In an odd twist, the more trusted a groom became, the more he was watched. Rumours swirled around those who spent too much time with the king, or seemed to influence his decisions a little too easily. Jealous courtiers whispered of bedroom politics and lavatory diplomacy, terms that carried more bite than jest. This culture of suspicion shaped the role itself. Grooms had to walk a razor-thin line between discretion and engagement. They had to be present, but not intrusive, helpful, but not meddling. They had to be indispensable, but never irreplaceable. The best grooms understood that their greatest power came from their silence. Even so, the temptation to speak, to act, to sway, must have been overwhelming. Imagine hearing a royal secret whispered during a post-dinner digestion. Imagine knowing the king's mood, his health, his grievances, before anyone else. Imagine watching the politics of the realm shift while standing quietly with a warm towel in hand. Could you resist the urge to lean in just a little? For many grooms, the answer was yes. Their legacy is one of loyalty, silence, and service. But for a few, perhaps just a handful, the line between service and self-interest blurred. They became participants in the very court intrigues they were meant to avoid. They listened too closely, advised too freely, and plotted too boldly. And when they fell hard. Still, the grooms remained. For every scandal, there were a dozen quiet years of faithful service. Most grooms never made headlines, never drew suspicion, and never became pawns in greater games. They simply served diligently and discreetly, holding together a world that could unravel with a single whispered rumour. Their scandals, real or imagined, tell us something essential about power. That it doesn't always wear a crown or carry a sword. Sometimes it stands quietly in a corner, holding a bowl of rosewater, listening. Power, as it turns out, often enters through unexpected doors, or in this case, emerges from behind a velvet curtain next to a very royal chamber pot. By the time England shuffled through the end of the Tudor dynasty and into the high tides of Stuart rule, the role of the Groom of the Stool had reached an apex of political weight that few could have foreseen. Far from being a mere footman with a nose for rosewater and patience for bowel movements, the groom had become something more. A man of true statecraft, who could move the levers of government from a seat quite unlike any other. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the reign of James I and his son Charles I, where the groom's authority, both soft and sharp, permeated the corridors of monarchy. No longer just a witness to the king's morning routine, the Groom of the Stool became a crucial filter between the monarch and his sprawling court. He managed correspondence, intercepted messages, curated access to the royal person, and, perhaps most dangerously, interpreted moods. In a palace as politically charged as Whitehall, where courtiers played intrigue like a symphony, controlling who spoke to the king and when was a superpower, the groom's proximity to the monarch during quiet routine moments, dressing, bathing and toileting, gave him opportunities no advisor or secretary of state could buy. These weren't just pauses in royal ceremony, they were intervals of startling intimacy when a king might let down his guard and mutter what he truly felt. In those moments, the groom was both confidant and gatekeeper. Historians still debate whether this access made the groom an unofficial policymaker or merely a sounding board. What is clear, though, is that many grooms during this period acted with deliberate influence. They shaped schedules, redirected visitors, and suggested alliances or appointments that otherwise might never have surfaced. Charles I's groom, for example, is thought to have played a quiet but notable role in facilitating conversations between the king and his more trusted courtiers during the fractious years leading up to the English Civil War. This wasn't a time of peaceful governance. Charles's reign was riddled with conflict between Parliament and Crown, between Protestant factions, and between the king's own sense of divine right and the shifting demands of an increasingly vocal political class. Within that tension, the groom stood as a kind of buffer. He was close enough to offer counsel, but removed enough to remain unofficial. That ambiguity made him both powerful and elusive, a shadow figure whose words echoed beyond the privy chamber. One story from this time suggests that Charles would often discuss military matters with his groom while preparing for bed, away from the prying ears of his council. These conversations were rarely documented, but a few letters survive in which advisers mention having spoken to His Majesty through the avenue of his domestic chamber. Translation: they made their case to the groom, who then relayed it upward, perhaps softened, perhaps sharpened. This form of filtered access was especially vital during moments of national crisis. When civil war loomed and the political atmosphere grew toxic, the groom's discretion became more than a matter of etiquette. It was survival. A misplaced word or visible loyalty to the wrong faction could bring ruin, and yet the groom endured, often slipping beneath the radar while others rose and fell. But it wasn't just politics that passed through the groom's hands. Money did too. The management of the royal household budget often involved the groom of the stool, particularly regarding the expenses of the king's private chambers. From ordering linens and perfumes to overseeing repairs on the close stool itself, the groom managed a small but symbolically rich empire. And like all empires, it came with the potential for, let's say, flexible accounting. There's a fringe account from the early 1600s that one groom, whose name is delightfully omitted, used his position to procure rare goods and resell them to courtiers at a profit. Whether this was opportunism or simple thrift is unknown, but it points to the kind of subtle power baked into the role. No one questioned the groom's purchases. Few dared challenge his requests. And so, whether he was ordering plum-coloured velvet or collecting sealed jars of imported pomade, the groom handled it all with the kind of authority most lords would envy. And still, all this occurred behind the curtain. There was no official office door, no public audience chamber. The groom worked within the folds of royal routine, half invisible, half indispensable. His tools were silence, trust, and presence, more potent than any sword or signature. Perhaps the most fascinating example of the groom's influence comes not from a direct political manoeuvre, but from the way others treated him. Ambassadors, keenly attuned to the rhythms of power, often sent gifts to the groom of the stool in hopes of favourable introductions. These weren't bribes in the crude sense, but rather tokens of goodwill. A bottle of Madeira, a silk kerchief, a delicately embroidered glove. Subtle gestures, all designed to sweeten the groom's opinion, and by extension, the king's. Records from the Venetian ambassador in 1625 detail how he secured a brief moment with His Majesty, owing to the kind intercession of the gentleman in charge of his private affairs. A poetic way, indeed, of saying the groom had given the nod. What makes this detail extraordinary is not just that it happened, but that it was normal. The groom had become an expected point of contact for those navigating the Byzantine etiquette of court diplomacy. Even domestically, powerful nobles recognised the groom's leverage. Some took care to remain on his good side, sending congratulations for family births or condolences for deaths. Letters were laced with flattery. One baron even described the groom as the quiet axis on which the court turns, which given the context is both accurate and rather pungent. Yet despite this elevated status, the groom had no formal political title. He was not a minister, not a chancellor, not a secretary. His rank came not from decree but from location, specifically his unbroken proximity to the royal person, and so, paradoxically, the very mundanity of his work gave it unmatched potential. No one else saw the king when the crown was off, the wig removed, and the robes folded on a chair. No one else heard the sighs, the complaints, the doubts voiced in the low murmur of early morning. It's no wonder some grooms used this access to shape the court. A well-placed word about a rival's insolence could bar them from favour. A kind observation about a loyal subject could open doors. These weren't overt manipulations, rather, they were subtle rearrangements of perspective, influence by suggestion, power by presence. And yet, not all monarchs were equally susceptible. Some kings maintained a rigid separation between personal service and political counsel. Others welcomed the overlap, leaning on the groom not just for slippers and soap, but for sanity in an otherwise perilous world. It was, in many ways, the ultimate test of character. How much would you trust the man holding your chamber pot? The answer, it turns out, was often quite a lot. One scholar once described the groom of the stool as the monarch's mirror, not reflecting the crown but the man who wore it. That may be the truest summation yet. In those quiet, unrecorded hours, the groom saw the king for what he was: human, vulnerable, uncertain. And in recognising that, the groom often became the only courtier who dared to speak with unvarnished honesty. Of course, that honesty could be a double-edged sword. Say too much, and you risked being accused of overreach. Say too little, and you became irrelevant. The most successful grooms walked the narrow path of quiet guidance, speaking only when needed and listening always. Their power was like water, shapeless, invisible, and utterly essential. By the close of the Stuart period, the position remained a cornerstone of royal domestic life. Even as England hurtled towards civil war, republican experiments, and eventual restoration, the groom endured, not as a relic, but as a fixture of continuity. While kings came and went, and Parliament rose in power, there was always someone to set out the stool, warm the linens, and stand beside the throne in its most literal form. There is a peculiar majesty in rituals, especially those that cling to the edge of absurdity. Few rituals in royal history better embody this than the stately, sometimes solemn, sometimes farcical ballet that was the king's daily toilet routine. By now you've followed the groom of the stool from his humble, if fragrant beginnings, into the shadows of real political power. But for all his influence, his primary function remained unwavering: to oversee, orchestrate, and occasionally directly assist in the royal act of, well, relieving oneself. The daily ritual of the royal stool session was no casual affair. It was a sequence of gestures choreographed to the rhythm of court etiquette, steeped in ceremony and cloaked, quite literally, in velvet and damask. The groom of the stool was the conductor of this most intimate symphony. Every step, from the moment the king's chamber door creaked open to the final folding of the towel, was performed with almost religious solemnity. The day typically began with what was known as the levee, or morning rising. While the levee is more famously associated with the Sun King, Louis XIV, its English equivalent was no less ceremonial. Upon waking, the king was attended by his personal staff, including the groom of the stool. After being dressed in stages, each layer of clothing a reminder of both status and protocol, the king would retire to his close stool. Here, the groom's role fully activated. The stool, positioned near a fireplace or under a window for light, was prepared in advance. The chamber pot within would be clean, lined with scented herbs or cloth, and flanked by a modest table bearing warm water, fresh linen, and a selection of perfumes or vinegar-soaked cloths. In some periods, small bells were even affixed to the stool, either to summon the groom or, more amusingly, to alert him to the royal readiness. The king would settle himself, often continuing to converse with his staff or reviewing documents presented by the groom. This period, odd as it may sound, was considered a moment of business and clarity. While seated, the king might issue minor commands, review reports, or request updates. Some monarchs found the moment oddly productive. Others preferred silence, contemplating their day while inhaling the mingled scents of lavender, sandalwood, and whatever unfortunate culinary indulgence had passed through them the night before. The groom, depending on the monarch's preference, either remained in the room or just outside the door listening for the telltale call. When summoned, he re-entered with practised grace, bringing fresh cloths and warm water. The cleaning itself, though rarely described in detail in surviving records for merciful reasons, was done with delicacy. The groom was expected to be gentle, efficient, and never visibly disturbed. No matter what awaited him beneath the royal robes, his face must remain serene. Afterward, the groom would discreetly remove the chamber pot, its contents covered, and retreat to clean and reset the equipment. This process was often repeated multiple times throughout the day. Monarchs did not, as some might imagine, hold everything in for a grand performance. Like any other human being, they answered nature's calls when they arrived, and the groom had to be ready each and every time. In particularly formal households, the act of transporting the royal waste was done with as much discretion as possible. Special linen coverings, polished lids, and designated exit routes were employed to keep the spectacle at a minimum. The groom or his assistant would take the pot to a private area where it was cleaned, disinfected, by the standards of the day, and prepared again. Occasionally the king's physician would examine the contents, checking for blood, changes in colour or consistency, all noted with the gravity of a scientific discovery. This process, while constant, was anything but lowly. The groom remained a high-status figure, and the ritual of the royal flush, if you will, continued to emphasise the divinity of the monarch's body. That even the king's digestion merited such attention speaks volumes about the era's perception of royalty. Everything he did was sacred, even what went into and out of him. The practice wasn't confined to men. Though the title Groom of the Stool applied exclusively to male monarchs, female royalty had their own attendants who managed similar duties. Queen Elizabeth I notably refused to name a formal Groom of the Stool, instead using her trusted ladies-in-waiting for such functions. She was fiercely protective of her image, and likely preferred the ambiguity and discretion such a system afforded. Interestingly, there are no surviving first-hand descriptions of Elizabeth's bathroom rituals, only vague references to the careful maintenance of Her Majesty's person. Even here, historians continue to argue, did Elizabeth, with all her fastidious control, allow her attendants to help her, or did she attempt to manage the task herself in private? Some speculate she may have devised her own methods, perhaps with hidden mechanisms or furniture designed to preserve her autonomy. The truth remains hidden beneath layers of linen and legacy. Back to the men. The rituals of the close stool continued to evolve with each reign. By the time we arrive at the court of Charles II, the furniture had become even more elaborate. One 17th century account describes a stool with concealed compartments, gilded trim, and a padded lid embroidered with the royal cipher. It was said to be so discreet that, when closed, it looked like a library chair. Whether this was for practical use or simply to spare guests from the discomfort of recognising the king's toilet mid-conversation is anyone's guess. And what about travel? The king's stool did not stay home when he ventured out. Portable versions were crafted, complete with folding frames, fitted basins, and travel cases lined with silk. The groom was responsible for managing its transport, often arriving at a site before the monarch to ensure everything was set up. Military campaigns, diplomatic visits, and royal progresses all required logistical planning not just for armies or carriages, but for poop. There's a remarkable side anecdote from the English Civil War, in which Charles I's portable stool was captured by enemy forces. The irony of a king's throne being taken so literally was not lost on contemporary commentators, though the incident was buried in more pressing political news. Still, it gives us a moment to appreciate how seriously these items were treated, not just as furniture, but as symbols of sovereignty. What fascinates historians and sociologists alike is how these rituals intertwine the sacred and the profane. The stool wasn't just a tool, it was a throne of necessity, and managing it became an act of devotion. The groom of the stool, far from being a glorified janitor, was the architect of these moments. He orchestrated cleanliness, preserved comfort, and protected the illusion that even the king's digestion obeyed divine order. All of this culminated in a role that defied the boundaries of what we think of as royal service. He wasn't simply a valet or nurse. He was the keeper of rhythm in the king's day, the guardian of his personal comfort, the filter of his mood, and the silent confidant to countless secrets. His duties were repeated daily, but each time they carried weight. A clean towel wasn't just hygiene, it was stability. A warm basin wasn't just comfort, it was continuity. In these small acts, kingdoms found routine. And through it all, the groom never left his post. He stood behind the scenes while others bowed in the spotlight. He saw the king not in his majesty, but in his humanity, and perhaps more than anyone, he understood that to serve a monarch fully, you must embrace not just the crown, but the whole of the man beneath it. The groom of the stool may have begun as a personal attendant to England's kings, but as the centuries unfurled, the role's strange intimacy extended to other royal family members. as the concept of royal dignity stretched and bent around custom, hygiene, and hierarchy, monarchs weren't the only ones whose bathroom needs became a matter of state. Princes, dukes, and even queens required their own systems of bodily management, and from this grew a curious expansion of the groom's duties. But not every member of the royal family embraced this assistance. One of the most intriguing refusals in royal history came from Queen Elizabeth I, who, unsurprisingly given her reputation, rejected the very idea of a groom of the stool. Elizabeth, the self-fashioned virgin queen, crafted her public image with military precision. Her body was not just her own, it was England's. Her flesh, her face, her every move was cloaked in symbolism and sovereign myth, and she knew it. Allowing another person, man or woman, to witness or assist her in such private moments would have undermined that myth. So instead, Elizabeth relied on a network of high-ranking ladies-in-waiting to assist her with dressing, bathing, and other bodily tasks. The most trusted among them, like Blanche Parry and Kat Ashley, served roles comparable to the groom, albeit with more discretion and less official naming. They helped with menstruation, illness, and possibly even toileting, but under the shroud of personal service, not political power. This absence of a female equivalent groom meant that the dynamics of court intimacy took a different shape in the Queen's reign. Instead of one highly influential chamber official managing personal access, Elizabeth surrounded herself with a carefully selected ring of women who acted as both protectors and proxies. They controlled information flow, managed foreign ambassadors' visits, and coordinated her public image, all while maintaining the fiction that she was untouchable, even in the most touchable of circumstances. Meanwhile, male members of the royal family followed their own variations of the stool protocol. Princes and high-ranking nobles typically had valets or attendants who managed their personal hygiene. In some cases, the term groom of the stool was adapted, though never with quite the same gravitas it held for reigning monarchs. These positions, too, were considered prestigious, especially for younger royals being groomed, no pun intended, for leadership. To be entrusted with the prince's comfort was to be granted proximity to future power. As the Georgian era dawned and the Hanoverians took the throne, this custom persisted. The court of George I and his successors maintained close stools for royals of various ranks, and personal valets continued to handle their use. However, the language around the role began to soften. The word stool gradually disappeared from official titles, replaced by more generic references to the groom of the bedchamber, or equerry. This linguistic shift mirrored a growing discomfort with overt references to bodily functions, as Enlightenment ideals and Georgian manners reshaped public life. Interestingly, while male royals often retained dedicated attendants, queens and princesses rarely did, at least not in the same fashion. The expectations of female modesty, shaped by centuries of cultural reinforcement, meant that royal women were meant to appear more self-contained. That didn't mean they were left entirely to their own devices, certainly not, but the work was distributed more diffusely among their ladies. It was done quietly, without spectacle, and often without official naming. This divergence created a strange imbalance in the court hierarchy. While male monarchs could elevate a groom of the stool into a powerful gatekeeper, queens relied on more collective structures. No single lady-in-waiting could dominate the way a groom might. Instead, the queen's bedchamber became a web of influence, interpersonal, layered, and often fraught with jealousy. One fringe anecdote from Queen Anne's reign, early 18th century, illustrates this dynamic perfectly. During a period of illness, Anne reportedly insisted that only Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, be allowed to assist her. The relationship between Anne and Sarah was famously intense. Some claim romantic, others see it as deeply emotional, but in this case, the Queen's trust bypassed protocol. For weeks, Sarah controlled access to Anne, influencing decisions, reading correspondence aloud, and even making minor policy suggestions. In many ways, she had stepped into the void where a groom might once have operated. Eventually, this intimacy backfired. Sarah's arrogance and open contempt for others at court led to a dramatic falling out, and her influence crumbled. But the episode highlighted how, even in the absence of formal titles, the functions of the groom, proximity, discretion, influence, could be replicated by others in the Queen's circle. This brings us to a fascinating question. Why did the Groom of the Stool never become a more standard fixture for queens? Historians still argue about this. Some suggest it was simply a matter of decorum. Others believe that the tightly knit female circles around royal women offered no room for a single dominant figure. Still others point to misogynistic traditions that viewed the female body as too mysterious or too unclean to be ritualized in the same way as the king's. Whatever the reason, the effect was clear. Male monarchs had a centralized structure for bodily care that doubled as a political lever. Female monarchs had a dispersed network that required constant management and careful balance. Queens had to juggle alliances between ladies, navigate jealousies, and ensure that no single woman gained too much control. It was politics in the powder room, and it required no less savvy than any battlefield. Meanwhile, the prince's chambers mirrored those of the king, albeit on a smaller scale. Young heirs were assigned valets and grooms who managed their toilet rituals with the same attention to dignity. These men were often long-time family retainers or trusted nobles, placed there not only to wipe and wash, but to listen. From the moment a royal child began using a close stool, he was under surveillance, not just for health, but for temperament, intellect, and ambition. This system of bodily observation fed directly into royal education. Tutors and physicians regularly consulted with attendants, asking for updates on appetite, digestion, and behaviour. Did the young prince wake up cheerful or morose? Was he constipated or restless? Even the most mundane details were considered potential indicators of character. The idea was simple. A future king's stomach might one day affect a nation's fate. And so, for royals male and female, the stool was both a necessity and a symbol. It represented the convergence of body and crown, the physicality of leadership. Whether attended by a noble groom or a discreet maid, the act of relieving oneself remained deeply political. There's something oddly grounding in that. In a world of divine right, inherited privilege, and velvet-lined privilege, the chamber pot sat at the centre of it all. No one, not kings, queens, or courtiers, could escape its pull. And those who managed its rituals, whether officially titled or not, were part of a centuries-long dance between flesh and power. In the scented, velvet-draped halls of royal power, there was one topic never discussed openly, but always whispered about. It was the taboo that hovered over every courtier's lips, discreetly acknowledged yet never fully named. It was, quite simply, poop. Though the Groom of the Stool wielded great power, the bodily functions he oversaw were rarely mentioned in polite conversation. Instead, they became a coded language, woven through court gossip, political innuendo, and subtle intrigue. In Tudor and Stuart times, there was little reticence around bodily functions compared to modern standards, at least in daily life. But within royal circles, where dignity was paramount and appearance everything, speaking plainly about bowel movements was a faux pas. The result was a fascinatingly delicate dance. Everyone knew precisely what the groom did, but no one dared call it by its name. Instead, euphemisms reigned supreme. Official records from the era skirted carefully around direct references. Instead of stating that the king was relieving himself, documents would vaguely describe him as occupied privately, or taking his ease. Even personal letters used guarded terms, noting the king's morning repose or private meditation. There were codes for everything, from describing the king's constipation as His Majesty's difficult humour, to acknowledging diarrhea as an excess of royal flux. Why the secrecy? Partly it was about preserving royal dignity. Monarchs represented divine authority, an image difficult to reconcile with the blunt realities of bodily waste. But it was also about power. By controlling the narrative around these sensitive topics, courtiers could manipulate perceptions of the king's health and temperament, weaponizing rumour as effectively as any sword or treaty. The groom himself was expected to maintain impeccable discretion, employing euphemism and silence to shield the monarch's dignity. He might report a king's distressing symptoms privately to the physician, but publicly he maintained a neutral expression, conveying nothing but calm authority. This secrecy gave him leverage. He held truths no one else knew. He could confirm or deny rumours with a single raised eyebrow, a subtly shaken head, or a carefully placed word. And the court listened carefully. At the merest hint of digestive trouble, speculation surged. Was the king unwell? Had he been poisoned? Was his mood likely to be sour, and therefore should petitions be delayed? In this sense, the royal bowel was a barometer not just of health, but of court politics. A monarch's bowels had the power to shift schedules, postpone diplomatic visits, or even affect legislation. One peculiar detail that emerged from this secrecy was the rise of toilet politics. Historians continue to debate whether specific decisions, appointments, dismissals, or diplomatic shifts were directly influenced by the king's gastrointestinal comfort. Yet anecdotal evidence from courtiers' letters suggests it was common knowledge that presenting sensitive issues after a heavy meal was unwise. It was also known that a monarch in the throes of constipation could be unpredictable, easily angered or rash. Henry VIII himself, who famously suffered digestive troubles later in life, illustrates this vividly. As he aged and grew increasingly volatile, courtiers watched his health obsessively. Chronic constipation tormented him, likely exacerbated by his meat-heavy diet and limited vegetable intake. His Groom of the Stool monitored every detail meticulously. The court in turn hung on each subtle clue. Was Henry constipated again? If so, it might explain a sudden temper tantrum or the rejection of a long-planned diplomatic proposal. This obsession with bowel health wasn't confined to England. Throughout Europe, monarchs' digestion was treated with similar reverence. King Louis XIV of France famously suffered digestive issues throughout his reign. French courtiers noted discreetly in letters and memoirs how the king's bowels shaped court etiquette. If Louis appeared pale or uncomfortable, petitions were quietly shelved, decisions delayed. The entire machinery of Versailles revolved subtly but unmistakably around the king's stomach. Yet, despite these practical implications, open discussion remained taboo. Courtiers spoke in hushed tones, letters were written in codes, and any direct acknowledgement of bodily functions was limited to private conversations between the groom and the royal physician. Everyone knew, yet nobody spoke plainly, creating a surreal atmosphere of dignified denial. One quirky example from the court of James I demonstrates just how far this taboo extended. A foreign envoy, unfamiliar with English court etiquette, once made the blunder of openly asking if the king's bowels had moved, causing horrified silence among courtiers. It took several minutes of diplomatic backpedaling before conversation resumed. The incident became legendary, a cautionary tale whispered to future visitors about the delicate art of euphemism. Within this taboo lay real dangers. Because the groom controlled sensitive information, he was both trusted and feared. Should he choose to leak rumours, accurate or not, the court could quickly descend into chaos. There's historical suspicion that certain grooms may have used their knowledge strategically, hinting at digestive trouble to discourage certain visitors or postpone meetings, thereby quietly influencing political decisions. But evidence remains elusive, couched as it always is in whispers and allusions. Interestingly, this secrecy around royal digestion gradually shifted during the Enlightenment. As scientific inquiry advanced, even the royal body became subject to rational study. Physicians began writing more openly about digestion and health, and the court's guarded language evolved into medical terminology. By the 18th century, references to fluxes and humours had given way to more straightforward, though still genteel, descriptions of bowel health. Yet even as language changed, the groom's discretion remained paramount. His role evolved too, focusing more on personal care and less explicitly on toilet duty. By the Georgian era, the Groom of the Stool had largely become the groom of the bedchamber, a subtle but significant shift away from bodily functions toward broader responsibilities. Still, the legacy of taboo lingered. Even today, royal historians handle this topic gingerly, conscious of how delicately it threads through centuries of court politics. The groom's true influence remains shrouded precisely because no one dared speak openly about the fundamental acts he oversaw. His power was wrapped in euphemism, his influence encoded in the silences and polite nods of courtiers. And perhaps that's the ultimate irony of this bizarre role. The Groom of the Stool wielded immense power precisely because the acts he managed were considered unspeakable. In a court where every word mattered, his silence spoke loudest of all. So remember, next time you encounter delicate euphemistic language around something embarrassingly human, it might just be the shadow of a Groom of the Stool standing quietly in history's corner, holding secrets so powerful they could shape kingdoms. In the swirling cauldron of court intrigue, few figures stood closer to the bubbling core than the Groom of the Stool. And as we've seen, proximity to power came with privileges, but it also came with risks. Being entrusted with the monarch's most private rituals was a profound honour. yet it placed the grooms squarely in the crosshairs of suspicion. Every whisper, every movement, every glance could be twisted into evidence of betrayal. When trust unravelled, the consequences were swift and often devastating. Throughout history, several grooms found themselves accused, or at least suspected, of disloyalty. Sometimes these accusations had merit, but more often they reflected the paranoia inherent in courts where gossip was currency and loyalty a fleeting commodity. Betrayal, after all, was easy to imagine. Who knew better the king's vulnerabilities than the man who saw him stripped of all pretension? Sir Henry Norris, famously executed under Henry VIII, offers a stark example of how swiftly fortune could reverse. Norris had been one of the king's closest friends, a regular hunting companion, and trusted confidant. Yet in the turbulent spring of 1536, as Anne Boleyn's downfall swept through court, Norris found himself trapped in a web of suspicion. Accused of adultery with the Queen, a charge most historians dismiss as absurd, Norris was arrested, tried hastily and executed within weeks. His headless body served as a grim reminder. No groom was ever truly safe. Historians still debate Norris's true crime. Was he genuinely close to Anne, causing jealousy in the volatile king? Or was he simply a convenient scapegoat sacrificed to justify Anne's removal? Whatever the truth, Norris's fall underscores the inherent danger of his position. A groom's intimacy with royalty could easily morph from privilege into peril. Yet Norris wasn't the only groom to face the axe. Others also discovered how quickly trust could evaporate. Consider the tense final days of Henry VIII's reign, when Sir Anthony Denny, trusted groom and longtime friend, became one of the few men permitted to speak frankly with the ailing king. As Henry lay dying, bloated and bedridden, Denny managed access to his bedside. He became, in effect, a gatekeeper to the succession. In those fevered final weeks, rumours swirled that Denny might manipulate Henry's final will or whisper false promises to secure power after the king's death. Though no charges materialised, the suspicion itself reveals the precariousness of his role. Any slip, any misjudgment could have landed Denny in the Tower, or worse. Such stories illustrate a central paradox of the groom's role. The very closeness that made him powerful also made him vulnerable. If he saw too much, he risked becoming a threat. If he knew too little, he risked irrelevance. And if the monarch ever doubted his loyalty, even momentarily, he risked everything. Across the English Channel, similar dynamics played out in France's own court. Louis XIV's chamber attendants, though not called grooms of the stool, faced identical pressures. Versailles was notoriously riddled with intrigue, and any servant who overheard too much could quickly become a liability. Several attendants found themselves quietly dismissed, imprisoned, or mysteriously disgraced when their loyalty came into question. The French understood well that anyone who held the king's confidence, especially in such delicate matters, held dangerous potential. Even the process of cleaning the king's chamber pot could become fraught with suspicion. Imagine a groom discovering blood in the royal stool, evidence of illness or potential poisoning. He faced a brutal choice: report it immediately and risk accusations of exaggeration, or delay and risk accusations of conspiracy. Either way, he was vulnerable. Such dilemmas were more than hypothetical. They shaped how grooms navigated their daily duties. This perpetual tension is captured vividly in a curious historical footnote from the early 1600s. During James I's reign, one groom allegedly became so paranoid about poisoning attempts that he personally tasted the king's food, an extraordinary step that wasn't part of his official duties. Whether motivated by genuine concern or calculated showmanship, this gesture highlights the constant anxiety surrounding the role. A groom's life was an endless balancing act between vigilance and suspicion, and yet, the grooms who did successfully navigate these treacherous waters reaped enormous benefits. They became respected figures at court, their loyalty unquestioned precisely because it had been so thoroughly tested. Surviving the pressures of such intimacy proved a groom's trustworthiness more convincingly than any written pledge or noble title. Still, the shadow of suspicion never vanished completely. Even long-serving grooms found themselves subject to whispers, especially in politically turbulent times. During the English Civil War, for example, the groom who served Charles I faced extraordinary scrutiny. Every interaction was dissected for signs of sympathy toward Parliament or royalist factions. His personal loyalty had to be beyond doubt, his conduct impeccable, or he risked being branded a traitor by one side or the other. One particularly poignant account from this period describes the arrest and questioning of Charles's valet, a man who fulfilled many duties traditionally performed by the Groom of the Stool. Accused of passing messages to royalist supporters, he was held in isolation for weeks, interrogated repeatedly, and ultimately released without charge. His only crime had been proximity. He simply knew too much, and was too trusted by a king whose authority was unravelling. Yet despite these dangers, few ever refused the role. For ambitious nobles, becoming Groom of the Stool was the ultimate validation of trust. It placed them at the heart of power, offering insights and influence unavailable anywhere else. Courtiers actively sought the position, fully aware of its risks, believing the potential rewards outweighed any danger. Even after episodes of betrayal, the office remained prestigious. After Norris's execution, Henry VIII swiftly appointed another groom, underscoring the position's essential nature. Its continuity was a statement. Whatever scandals occurred, the throne required someone loyal enough and brave enough to stand by the monarch's most intimate side. By the 17th century, monarchs became more selective, choosing grooms whose loyalty had been rigorously vetted. Trusted noble families groomed their sons for decades to earn royal favour, ensuring the job remained securely within a small, dependable circle. This careful management reduced the risk of betrayal, but never eliminated it entirely. Ultimately, the groom's precarious position reflects a fundamental truth about royal power. Intimacy invites suspicion. The monarch's trust, once given, could turn to paranoia in an instant. Yet even in the face of this danger, the position endured, precisely because someone had to bear witness to royal vulnerability. The Groom of the Stool thus became a living paradox. Trusted yet watched, powerful yet powerless, indispensable yet expendable. He served not only as a caretaker, but as a barometer of a royal confidence. His fate was intimately tied to the monarch's mood, his fortunes rising and falling with every whispered word and carefully folded towel. And as each groom quietly fulfilled his duties, he carried with him the weight of this contradiction. Loyalty always shadowed by suspicion, influence forever balanced by risk. He stood closest to power, yet never fully possessed it. His role defined not just by what he did, but by how carefully he avoided doing too much. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, consider the Groom of the Stool, the man whose very presence embodied the fragility of trust, whose silent vigilance shielded monarchs from harm, and whose every action was shadowed by the silent threat of betrayal. If you think the British court had a monopoly on bizarre bathroom rituals, prepare yourself. Across the English Channel, the French court took things to a whole new level of grandeur and grotesquerie. Welcome to Versailles, the shimmering epicenter of European royal power, and arguably the smelliest palace ever to glitter under crystal chandeliers. While the English had their Grooms of the Stool, the French court of Louis XIV had its own version, a small army of servants whose entire existence revolved around the Sun King's bodily functions, and as we'll soon discover, Versailles might have been more magnificent, but its bathrooms, if we can call them that, were decidedly less so. The French equivalent of the Groom of the Stool was known as the Premier Valet de Chambre, or First Valet of the Chamber, though this title hardly captures the range of duties involved. Like his English counterpart, the Premier Valet managed the king's personal hygiene, dressed and undressed him, oversaw bathing, and yes, handled toilet duties. But in the French system, there wasn't just one valet. Louis XIV had several valets assigned to his personal service, creating layers of attendance that made the English groom's job seem positively straightforward. Every morning at Versailles began with the elaborate ceremony of the lever, a ritualized awakening and dressing of the king that lasted hours. A select group of nobles gathered each day, waiting impatiently for the signal that Louis was awake. The first valet entered first, attending to the most intimate aspects of waking the king, including assisting with his morning bodily relief. Following him, more valets would arrive, each assigned a specific task: washing the king's hands, preparing his clothing, combing his wig, presenting him with scented cloths and fresh linens. It was choreography of staggering precision, entirely devoted to the care and comfort of the royal body. Yet, as luxurious as all this sounds, Versailles had notoriously lax approach to sanitation. For all its splendour, the palace had precious few private facilities. courtiers relieved themselves discreetly in hallways, stairwells, and even behind tapestries. Chamber pots were hidden throughout the palace, ready at a moment's notice. The king's own close stool, elegantly upholstered, richly embroidered, and housed within a special chamber, was hardly an exception. Waste disposal was sporadic at best, and the mingled odours of perfume, sweat, and less pleasant scents filled the air. The premier valet, along with assistants, managed the king's close stool meticulously, but outside this small circle, hygiene standards were shockingly low. Visitors to Versailles frequently commented on the pervasive stench. One horrified ambassador described it as a mingling of fine perfumes and foul odours, creating a miasma that lingered in every room. Another wrote with astonishment that courtiers seemed oblivious, happily chatting and dancing amid the unmistakable smell of urine. Despite, or perhaps because of, this casual attitude toward hygiene, Louis XIV himself was obsessive about cleanliness, at least by contemporary standards. He bathed regularly, weekly, a rarity for the time, wore heavily scented clothing, and had his premier valet carefully oversee his private toilet. Yet this personal hygiene paradoxically highlighted the palace's broader filth. Louis might have been impeccably groomed, but his court was anything but. As at the English court, these personal attendants wielded immense informal influence. The premier valet's proximity to the king made him a target for flattery, bribes, and political manoeuvring. Courtiers whispered their petitions in the valet's ear, hoping he might relay their words to the king during a quiet moment. Foreign diplomats cultivated relationships with him, sending gifts and notes in an effort to sway royal opinion. One especially infamous valet, Alexandre Bontemps, served Louis XIV for decades and became one of the most powerful men at Versailles. Officially, Bontemps held no political title, but unofficially he controlled access to the king with an iron hand. He decided which nobles could attend the king's morning ritual, who could deliver messages, and when, and even if, they might speak privately with Louis. His power was so complete that contemporary commentators called him the real minister behind the throne. Yet even Bontemps maintained the discreet silence required of his role. Like the groom of the stool, he saw everything and said nothing, wielding his influence subtly. Courtiers might speculate about his loyalties, but few dared accuse him openly of intrigue. His position was simply too secure, protected by the intimacy and trust that bound him directly to the king. But Versailles' approach to bodily functions wasn't just a reflection of Louis's personal habits, it was deeply rooted in symbolism and status. Everything the Sun King did was meant to showcase his absolute authority. The elaborate ceremony surrounding his daily rituals reinforced his position at the pinnacle of courtly life. By allowing nobles to assist, even in minor ways, he maintained control, doling out intimacy as a reward. Helping the king dress or witnessing his morning routine wasn't just a duty, it was a privilege signalling favour and influence. One curious fringe detail from Versailles reveals just how seriously courtiers took these rituals. Nobles competed fiercely to be granted the right to hold the king's robe, hand him his slippers, or even carry away his chamber pot. The latter task, distasteful though it was considered a particular honour, reserved for those the king wished to elevate publicly. It might seem absurd now, but at the time, nobles fought bitterly over these assignments, knowing the visibility and prestige that came with them. Yet not everyone embraced this bizarre competition. Some observers, particularly visitors from more modest courts, expressed outright disgust. They saw the rituals as demeaning, a grotesque exaggeration of royal vanity. To them, the mingling of bodily functions with political symbolism wasn't majestic. It was repulsive. These contrasting reactions highlight an enduring scholarly debate. Was Versailles' approach to bodily functions a calculated demonstration of absolute monarchy, or simply evidence of extravagant excess? Historians remain divided. Some argue Louis XIV deliberately cultivated the rituals around his body to reinforce his status. Others suggest the customs evolved organically, born of habit and tradition, becoming more elaborate over time. Whatever the cause, the result was clear. Versailles, for all its grandeur, was a place where beauty coexisted uneasily with filth, where ceremony masked odours, and where the private acts of the monarch were as public as his proclamations. In this strange duality, the premier valet, like the groom of the stool in England, thrived. His role might have seemed absurd, even comical, yet it carried weighty significance. He managed not just the king's comfort, but his very image, preserving the illusion of divine authority even in its most vulnerable moments. And so, in France as in England, the palace chamber pot wasn't merely functional. It was symbolic, a porcelain vessel brimming with political possibility. The attendants who managed it, whether groom or valet, were more than servants. They were guardians of dignity, whisperers of influence, and silent keepers of the secrets that lay beneath royal robes. The Premier Valet's quiet presence at Versailles underscores a universal truth about royal courts everywhere. Power, even at its most absolute, remains deeply human. Beneath the glittering facade of thrones and crowns, beneath every velvet cloak and embroidered slipper, kings, and those who served them, were still flesh and blood, still subject to nature's call. So as you drift towards sleep, spare a thought for Versailles. A palace of dreams built atop the mundane realities of humanity, where even the Sun King's magnificence depended, in the end, upon the quiet dignity of a servant holding a scented towel. Like any historical institution, the role of the groom of the stool couldn't last forever. Though it endured through centuries, surviving wars, upheavals, and political revolutions, its decline was inevitable, shaped by changing views on privacy, dignity, and even plumbing. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, shifts in culture, hygiene, and royal etiquette began slowly eroding the groom's once indispensable position. It wasn't a dramatic fall, but rather a quiet fading, a gentle glide toward obsolescence as the world evolved beyond the intimate rituals that had defined monarchy for generations. As Europe entered the Enlightenment, a fresh wave of ideas swept through court and country alike. Scientific advances, rational thinking, and increasing demands for personal privacy slowly changed expectations around bodily functions. The frank, communal openness of earlier centuries gave way to a new etiquette, one that valued modesty, discretion, and individual dignity. What had once been considered royal intimacy increasingly appeared vulgar, even backward. In this new age of decorum, the groom's role began to feel outdated. Monarchs who once relied on attendants for every bodily function began withdrawing, craving the simple dignity of privacy. Even if absolute solitude wasn't yet possible, the presence of a high-ranking noble standing patiently with a towel felt increasingly awkward, an embarrassing relic from a less refined era. At the same time, innovations in plumbing and sanitation quietly revolutionized royal palaces. By the late Georgian period, flush toilets, though still rare, began appearing in royal households. The palace at Windsor was fitted with early versions of these devices, and gradually even Buckingham Palace followed suit. While initially unreliable and sometimes even dangerous, these early flush toilets signalled the beginning of the end for the groom's practical function. If a king or queen could simply press a lever or pull a chain, why require a noble attendant to carry away the evidence? Of course, these new systems weren't immediately adopted everywhere. Royals, notoriously conservative about their comforts, sometimes resisted change. But the trend was clear. The era of the royal close stool was drawing to a close. Chamber pots, perfumed cloths, and velvet-upholstered seats gradually gave way to porcelain, running water, and pipes hidden discreetly behind walls. As plumbing improved, so too did attitudes toward hygiene. Doctors and reformers promoted cleanliness not just as a matter of comfort, but as a moral imperative. Cleanliness was now next to godliness, and what had once been tolerated, open chamber pots, communal relief, was now viewed as dirty, even dangerous. Royals, keen to project modernity and respectability, began distancing themselves from these older practices, preferring to present an image of refinement, sophistication, and, above all, cleanliness. Yet this shift didn't happen overnight, nor without resistance. Some older courtiers clung to traditional practices, dismissing new plumbing as undignified or suspiciously modern. They worried aloud about bad airs trapped in pipes, or lamented the loss of ritual dignity. For these holdouts, the groom remained a reassuring presence, evidence that tradition still held sway in a rapidly changing world. But even among the nostalgic, the groom's political influence diminished rapidly. Where once he might have whispered secrets or mediated delicate diplomacy during intimate moments by the 19th century, his responsibilities shrank dramatically. He became increasingly little more than a ceremonial figure, a token of continuity rather than an active participant in politics. During Queen Victoria's reign, this evolution reached a decisive point. Victoria, famously prudish and fiercely protective of her privacy, viewed the groom's traditional functions with embarrassment. Early in her reign, she quietly phased out much of the role's more intimate responsibilities, shifting them to ordinary servants or handling them privately. The groom's once powerful duties were now symbolic, attending the Queen's dressing or overseeing the royal apartments, rather than assisting with bodily functions. Victoria's stance was widely shared by her contemporaries, reflecting broader social changes. The Victorians, obsessed with propriety and modesty, couldn't fathom the open intimacy of previous courts. Publicly acknowledging bodily functions became almost taboo, shrouded in silence, euphemism, or outright denial. Within this culture, the groom's role was a historical embarrassment, best hidden or quietly forgotten. Still, the position survived into the early 20th century, lingering as a ceremonial relic. The title itself became increasingly symbolic, awarded to high-ranking nobles as an honour rather than a functional appointment. Few grooms performed anything remotely resembling the role's original duties. Instead, they attended royal functions, escorted the monarch during ceremonial occasions, or simply provided historical continuity. One telling detail from the reign of Edward VII, Victoria's son, underscores how completely the groom's original purpose had faded. Edward, known for his indulgent lifestyle and keen interest in modern conveniences, embraced indoor plumbing and modern hygiene enthusiastically. His groom of the Stool, a dignified nobleman with impeccable manners, never once carried a chamber pot or linen towel. Instead, he served as a glorified personal assistant, arranging royal engagements and managing household logistics. The groom had become, in effect, the king's private secretary. By the time George V ascended the throne in 1910, the title was almost entirely honorary. The king's groom, by then usually called groom of the bedchamber, performed no intimate duties whatsoever. His role was limited to social functions, minor household management, and occasional attendance at ceremonial events. He retained no real political power, no significant influence, and certainly no duties involving bodily hygiene. Yet, for all its redundancy, the title lingered, a curious historical relic, hanging on out of sheer tradition. The final blow to the role came, fittingly, with the modernising winds of the 20th century. As the monarchy adapted to the demands of media scrutiny, public opinion, and democratic expectations, any association with the groom's original duties became unthinkable. Even symbolic titles were quietly phased out or renamed. The royal household streamlined itself, shedding archaic positions and focusing on efficient professional management. Today, the groom of the Stool exists only in history, an amusing, slightly scandalous chapter in royal folklore. Its decline, though gentle, reflects profound shifts in society. From communal openness to personal privacy, from tradition to modernity, and from unquestioned monarchy to constitutional figureheads. Yet even in decline, the groom leaves a legacy worth pondering. His centuries-long journey from intimacy to obsolescence mirrors broader cultural trends. His role embodied the slow transformation of privacy, dignity and power, concepts still shaping our society today. So as you drift into dreams tonight, spare a thought for the groom's gentle fading, a role whose disappearance reminds us that even the most seemingly permanent institutions change over time, nudged aside by progress, plumbing, and the quiet march of history. Though the groom of the Stool disappeared from royal courts over a century ago, faint echoes of his role linger even today. Modern royal households may pride themselves on discretion, privacy, and sleek professionalism, but beneath the polished surface remains a shadowy trace of intimate service and quiet confidences. Today's royal aides, private secretaries, valets, personal assistants, still embody aspects of the groom's legacy, though thankfully without the chamber pots and scented towels. Indeed, modern royal attendants manage a delicate balance of trust, discretion, and quiet influence, reminiscent of their historical predecessor. Personal assistants to contemporary monarchs maintain rigorous confidentiality, guarding private conversations, sensitive family matters, and behind-the-scenes tensions. Like the grooms of old, these staff members see royalty at their most vulnerable, though now the vulnerability lies in emotional strain, health crises, or private grief, rather than bodily functions. Consider the private secretaries to Queen Elizabeth II, who throughout her 70-year reign played crucial roles behind closed doors. Trusted deeply by the Queen, these aides managed her schedule, correspondence, and confidential matters with a discretion that would make even the most cautious groom of the stool proud. They navigated personal family crises, guided the monarch through political upheaval, and offered quiet counsel, all without ever publicly revealing the depth of their influence. Similarly, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, had his own small circle of trusted attendants who discreetly managed his daily affairs. Though Philip famously disliked unnecessary ceremony, he still required support in maintaining his rigorous schedule, personal correspondence, and private needs. The Duke's valet, like the grooms of earlier times, was responsible not only for managing clothing and personal effects, but for understanding the Duke's moods, preferences, and daily rhythms. It wasn't toilet duty, but it certainly echoed the personal attentiveness that defined the groom's original role. Even younger royals continue this tradition in subtle ways. Princes William and Harry, as well as King Charles III, maintain trusted aides whose roles blend official duties with personal confidences. These modern courtiers may not carry chamber pots, but they still carry secrets, often deeply personal ones, about the stresses, struggles, and triumphs of royal life. Their influence, though quiet and understated, remains significant. Yet it would be misleading to suggest the groom's direct legacy continues unchanged. Modern royal households emphasize professionalism, privacy, and emotional boundaries in ways earlier courts never dreamed of. The explicit intimacy that once defined royal service has been deliberately dismantled, replaced by clear lines of responsibility, formal contracts, and official oversight. Where the groom once operated quietly within the monarch's bedroom, today's royal aides have formal offices, clear job descriptions, and meticulously defined roles. They are accountable not just to the monarch but to the public, Parliament, and media scrutiny. Even so, their positions still depend fundamentally on trust, earned slowly, maintained carefully, and never guaranteed. Historians still debate exactly how much modern royal households consciously distance themselves from the groom's uncomfortable legacy. Some argue that today's meticulous professionalism is partly a reaction against the excesses and humiliations of earlier centuries. Others believe modern privacy standards simply reflect broader cultural shifts toward dignity, autonomy, and respect, values incompatible with the groom's original role. Either way, contemporary royals are keenly aware of their ancestors' intimate lives. Palace historians and archivists quietly preserve artifacts linked to the groom's history. Velvet-covered close stools, embroidered towels, silver chamber pots, all kept safely out of public view, stored away as reminders of how far the monarchy has come. One particularly curious artifact, housed privately at Windsor Castle, is an intricately embroidered stool once belonging to George III. Its velvet upholstery and gilded accents reveal the lavish care given even to the most mundane objects. While never publicly displayed, it serves as a private historical memento, a subtle acknowledgement of royal vulnerability, humanity, and the changing nature of service over centuries. Museums occasionally display replicas or surviving examples of royal toilet furniture, typically prompting amusement and mild embarrassment among visitors. These displays, though humorous, offer gentle reminders of royal humanity. No matter how grand the crown or lavish the robes, even monarchs once depended intimately on attendants whose loyalty was tested daily. Interestingly, echoes of the groom's role can also be seen outside the palace. Modern celebrities, politicians, and corporate leaders often employ personal assistants or valets whose duties blend professional service with intimate knowledge of their private lives. Though far removed from royal courts, these modern equivalents manage similarly delicate balances: discretion and access, trust and influence, vulnerability and professionalism. In fact, contemporary celebrity culture frequently mirrors the groom's historical paradox. Personal assistants to famous actors, musicians, or politicians may manage deeply personal tasks, handling health issues, emotional crises, or sensitive family matters. Their roles often extend far beyond professional duties, resembling the intimacy and discretion once required of royal attendants, and like the groom, their influence often remains invisible, yet deeply felt behind the scenes. Even in political life, personal assistants to presidents, prime ministers, and world leaders play comparable roles. They manage schedules, prepare clothing, oversee medication, and shield their employers from intrusive scrutiny. Their discretion, like the groom's, is essential to preserving the leader's dignity, privacy, and authority. While they no longer manage bodily functions, they still bear witness to vulnerabilities others never see. Of course, the most significant shift between historical grooms and modern attendants is ethical. Today, expectations around consent, autonomy, and personal boundaries are paramount. The intimacy demanded by earlier courts would now be viewed as exploitative or inappropriate. Modern aides operate with strict professionalism, safeguarding personal dignity rather than exposing it. Yet even amid these crucial changes, the underlying dynamics of intimacy, trust, and discretion endure. Humans, royal or otherwise, still require personal support in vulnerable moments. Leaders and celebrities still depend on quiet, trusted confidants who can navigate delicate personal matters without embarrassment or betrayal. So while the groom of the stool himself is long gone, his essence lingers subtly in modern forms. Today's royal attendants, personal assistants, and private secretaries all carry forward his legacy, adapting it to modern ethics and expectations. They may no longer wield scented cloths, but they still wield discretion, influence, and quiet loyalty. Powers as subtle, enduring, and essential now as they were centuries ago. As you drift to sleep tonight, imagine these quiet modern courtiers standing discreetly behind closed doors, holding secrets, managing personal struggles, and quietly shaping history, just as their distant predecessors once did. Though their roles have evolved, their quiet vigilance remains timeless. Today, the groom of the stool remains one of history's favourite enigmas, a paradox of power and humiliation, intimacy and influence, privilege and embarrassment. Yet for all we've uncovered about his duties, rituals and scandals, historians still debate the true nature of his position. Was it a clever political manoeuvre, a cruel joke played by monarchy on nobility, or a deeply symbolic act of loyalty? The arguments continue, echoing softly through academic halls, museum corridors, and late-night historical documentaries. One school of thought sees the groom's role as a profound power play by monarchs, a calculated choice to bind high-ranking nobles directly to their service through a deliberately humiliating duty. From this perspective, kings like Henry VIII deliberately appointed nobles as grooms to reinforce their dominance, demonstrating that no rank was high enough to avoid personal service to the crown. In this view, the groom's very dignity became currency, traded willingly, if reluctantly, for royal favour and influence. Supporters of this theory point to historical examples like Henry Norris and Anthony Denny, whose appointments clearly tied powerful nobles directly to the king's person. The humiliating aspects of the role weren't accidental. They were intentional, forcing nobles to acknowledge their dependence on royal favour. By accepting the groom's duties, nobles publicly demonstrated loyalty, submission and humility, reinforcing the monarch's dominance. Yet other historians argue passionately against this interpretation, seeing the role not as humiliation, but as honour. In their view, the groom's duties, though distasteful by modern standards, weren't shameful in their original context. Tudor and Stuart society operated by different rules around hygiene, privacy, and bodily functions. Rather than humiliating the groom, the role elevated him to unprecedented intimacy with the monarch. In this interpretation, assisting the king with his bodily needs wasn't degrading. It was the highest possible demonstration of trust. Proponents of this theory point out that nobles actively sought the position, competed for it fiercely, and viewed it as an unparalleled privilege. The groom of the stool wasn't merely tolerated, he was respected, envied, and admired by peers. Contemporary accounts consistently portray the groom as dignified, influential, and central to court life. Far from humiliation, the role was one of honour, confidence, and prestige. A third scholarly camp sees the role as a symbolic manifestation of monarchical intimacy and vulnerability. From this viewpoint, the groom of the stool represented the monarch's humanity and mortality, quietly acknowledging that even kings were subject to bodily functions and personal frailties. The groom's presence underscored the paradox at monarchy's heart: divine authority paired with mortal vulnerability, absolute power balanced by absolute dependence. These scholars argue the role wasn't about humiliation or political manipulation, but about symbolic intimacy. By sharing his most private bodily moments with a trusted servant, the monarch subtly communicated trust, vulnerability, and intimacy, qualities often absent from formal court rituals. The groom's duties embodied the paradoxical humanity of kingship itself, reminding both monarch and subjects that beneath royal robes lay ordinary human flesh. Further complicating these debates is the groom's undeniable political influence. Regardless of whether the role was intentionally humiliating, honourable or symbolic, the fact remains, grooms frequently leveraged their positions for political gain. This practical reality complicates any purely symbolic interpretation. How can historians separate political manipulation from genuine honour or symbolic intimacy? One famous example often cited is Henry VIII's groom, Anthony Denny. In Henry's final years, Denny clearly exercised immense political power, controlling access, managing the king's schedule, and even shaping succession plans. Denny wasn't merely a symbolic presence, he was an active political player. How, then, do historians reconcile the groom's symbolic role with his very real political impact? Perhaps the answer lies in acknowledging complexity. The groom's role wasn't singular, it encompassed multiple meanings simultaneously. It was both humiliating and honourable, political and symbolic, intimate and manipulative. Different monarchs, different grooms, and different historical moments emphasised varying aspects of the role, shifting fluidly between symbolism, politics and intimacy. Still, debates persist, fuelled by ongoing discoveries, reinterpretations and scholarly arguments. As historians uncover new sources, letters, diaries, court records, they continue re-evaluating the groom's significance. Each new piece of evidence adds nuance, deepens understanding, and sparks fresh arguments. Was a particular groom motivated by personal ambition or genuine loyalty? Did a monarch appoint him strategically or sentimentally? The questions multiply endlessly, driving historical scholarship forward. Moreover, contemporary popular culture frequently reinterprets the groom's role through modern lenses. Films, novels and television series regularly feature him, often as comic relief, sometimes as a tragic figure. These portrayals, though fictionalized, shape public perceptions of historical reality. Popular culture often emphasizes humiliation or absurdity, reinforcing the idea that monarchy's intimate rituals were fundamentally ridiculous. Yet serious scholarship continually pushes back against simplistic interpretations, highlighting the complexities, contradictions, and cultural contexts that defined the groom's duties. Public imagination, academic rigour, and historical realities all weave together, creating a tapestry of understanding and misunderstanding that keeps the groom of the stool endlessly fascinating. Ultimately, perhaps the groom's greatest historical significance lies precisely in his ambiguity. His role embodied so many contradictions, intimacy and power, dignity and humiliation, symbolism and practicality, that no single interpretation can fully capture his essence. Historians may never agree entirely on what the groom of the stool truly represented, and perhaps that's the point. His enduring mystery challenges simplistic notions of royal authority, human dignity, and historical interpretation itself. So tonight, as you settle into dreams, consider the groom's complexity, a role whose layers of meaning still provoke debate centuries later. His paradoxical existence reminds us that history is never simple, never fully resolved, always open to reinterpretation. And as we drift off, maybe it's comforting to know that even the most absurd, intimate, or embarrassing chapters of our past still hold secrets worth discovering. Sleep well, knowing history's mysteries will always offer new questions, fresh insights, and gentle, endless debates, reminding us all to embrace the complexity of our shared human story. Tucked away in the corners of museums, archives, and private collections are peculiar artifacts quietly waiting to be discovered. Objects that whisper softly about a role long vanished from public life. These artifacts, humble yet ornate, humorous yet dignified, bring the groom of the stool's hidden history back to life. Each velvet-covered stool, silver chamber pot, or embroidered linen towel carries secrets, stories, and subtle echoes of the past. Tonight, let's gently uncover these hidden histories, exploring the silent objects that bear witness to centuries of royal intimacy. Our journey begins at Hampton Court Palace, where a small chamber, hidden from public view, once housed Henry VIII's own close stool. While the original object no longer survives, a detailed description from court inventories paints a vivid picture. A carved oak stool upholstered in crimson velvet, embroidered in gold thread with the royal cipher. The chamber pot itself, likely silver or pewter, was discreetly housed within, unseen but essential. Even empty, it was a throne in miniature, crafted with meticulous care. Curiously, visitors to Hampton Court today can see a replica close stool, a surprisingly popular exhibit tucked discreetly within the palace's historic apartments. Though intended partly as humorous educational display, the replica offers visitors a tangible connection to royal intimacy. People smile and chuckle, perhaps embarrassed, yet fascinated by the stool's quiet testimony. Even the most powerful king required assistance with the most basic human needs. Far north at Edinburgh Castle, another curious artefact awaits discovery. A finely wrought silver chamber pot once belonging to James VI of Scotland, later James I of England. Inscribed discreetly with James's royal emblem, it survives in nearly pristine condition, a luxurious private object crafted with subtle dignity. On special occasions it emerges briefly from storage for exhibition, surprising visitors with its elegance. Here is tangible proof that even royal waste demanded royal splendour. Nearby, in London's Victoria and Albert Museum, an ornate porcelain chamber pot from the Georgian era sits quietly within a glass case, almost overlooked amid grander exhibits. Delicately painted with floral motifs and gilt edging, it represents the pinnacle of craftsmanship applied to even mundane objects. This pot was likely intended for a high-ranking noble or royal, gently reminding museum-goers that luxury and utility coexisted even in the most intimate contexts. Yet perhaps the most intriguing artefacts lie hidden in private archives, letters, diaries and inventories detailing the groom's daily duties. Within Windsor Castle's vast archive, meticulously preserved documents quietly record transactions of scented towels, silk linens and necessaries for His Majesty's chamber. Each purchase reveals details about royal preferences, hygiene habits, and evolving standards of dignity. Historians gently sift through these faded pages, uncovering subtle clues to the groom's invisible labours. One particularly revealing diary, written by a 17th century courtier at Charles II's court, describes with remarkable candour the king's personal habits. Hidden discreetly among mundane court gossip, the diarist notes Charles's preference for lavender-scented linen and his dislike of overly ornate chamber pots. These trivial details illuminate royal personality, reminding us that behind public grandeur lay ordinary human quirks and preferences. Yet perhaps the most touching artefact of all is preserved at Windsor Castle, a simple embroidered linen towel from George III's reign. Though faded and fragile, the towel bears George's royal cipher stitched delicately in gold thread, a humble object imbued with quiet dignity. Its very simplicity speaks volumes, capturing the groom's daily duties with understated elegance. It's an intimate relic, rarely displayed publicly, but occasionally brought out by palace archivists for scholarly examination. Historians and curators handle these objects gently, aware of their fragility and historical significance. Each artefact is treated respectfully, even reverently, recognised as a quiet witness to royal vulnerability. Museum labels rarely explain these objects fully, relying instead on subtle references or euphemisms. Visitors reading these labels must interpret their meaning, piecing together clues to reconstruct hidden histories. Yet museums aren't the only places where these artefacts quietly linger. Occasionally, auction houses feature rare royal chamber pots or stools, often fetching surprisingly high prices from collectors fascinated by their intimate associations. A recent auction featured a Georgian-era close stool, complete with original velvet upholstery and hidden porcelain chamber pot. Bidders competed fiercely, driving prices upward, captivated by the stool's quirky history. Even popular culture occasionally revives interest in these hidden artefacts. Historical films and television series often recreate royal bathrooms with meticulous accuracy, sourcing period-appropriate props and furnishings. Audiences laugh, blush, or cringe at these scenes, yet remain fascinated by the carefully researched authenticity. The chamber pots and close stools on screen quietly remind viewers of monarchy's human side. Ordinary, embarrassing, yet universally relatable. Meanwhile, historical reenactors at palaces and museums delight in sharing these intimate details with visitors. At places like Hampton Court and Versailles, costumed guides gently educate audiences about royal hygiene practices, using authentic replicas and careful explanations. Their presentations balance humour and dignity, illuminating historical context while respectfully acknowledging modern sensibilities. In scholarly circles, these hidden histories continue inspiring research and publication. Historians regularly publish articles, chapters, and entire books devoted to royal hygiene practices, intimate service, and the groom's role. Conferences and lectures draw enthusiastic audiences eager to explore these lesser-known aspects of court life. Academics present findings gently, aware of modern sensitivities, yet deeply committed to historical accuracy. Still, some museum visitors or readers remain uncomfortable confronting royal bodily functions directly. Curators and authors recognise this, often employing delicate language, subtle euphemism, or gentle humour to ease discomfort. Educational materials acknowledge embarrassment, gently reassuring audiences that curiosity is natural and historical exploration valuable, even when uncomfortable. Ultimately, these hidden artifacts offer important historical lessons. They remind us of human vulnerability, dignity and intimacy, universal experiences shared even by kings. Objects once dismissed as trivial or embarrassing now inspire thoughtful reflection, gently challenging assumptions about power, privacy, and propriety. They also remind historians and audiences alike that history isn't composed solely of grand battles, treaties, or political intrigues. History also encompasses ordinary human experiences, daily routines, and intimate relationships. By exploring these hidden histories, we enrich understanding of past lives, royal and common alike, capturing nuances overlooked in traditional narratives. So as you drift toward dreams tonight, imagine these quiet artifacts patiently waiting in museum storerooms and palace archives, silently holding memories, secrets, and gentle truths. Each embroidered towel, silver pot, and velvet stool quietly testifies to humanity's shared experiences, vulnerabilities, and quiet dignity. Sleep gently tonight, comforted by the knowledge that history's secrets, however intimate or humble, remain patiently waiting, inviting exploration, reflection, and quiet empathy across centuries. The Groom of the Stool's journey through history is nearly complete. After centuries of intimate service, quiet influence, and whispered scandals, his role faded gently into obsolescence, leaving behind only echoes and artifacts. Yet, in many ways, his legacy remains powerful, reminding us how even the most embarrassing, mundane, or absurd aspects of human experience can shape history in subtle ways. The Groom's story gently illustrates how power and intimacy intertwine, how dignity and humiliation coexist, and how humanity's shared vulnerabilities quietly bind us all, royal or commoner, past or present. His role embodies paradox, simultaneously powerful and powerless, honoured and humiliated, essential and obsolete. It is precisely this complexity that makes the Groom of the Stool endlessly fascinating, challenging our assumptions about royalty, privacy, and historical memory itself. As we've explored tonight, the Groom wasn't merely a footnote to royal history. He was integral to court life, diplomacy, and politics. His duties, however mundane or embarrassing, were essential to maintaining royal dignity and authority. By carefully managing royal vulnerability, he safeguarded the monarch's image, subtly reinforcing notions of divine power and absolute authority. Yet beyond symbolism, the Groom wielded very real political influence, shaping decisions, alliances, and successions through discreet conversations, quiet suggestions, and carefully timed interventions. His power was subtle but profound, rooted in intimacy rather than formal authority. And though historians still debate the exact nature of his role, whether honourable, humiliating, or symbolic, all agree on his quiet historical significance. Today, we often overlook the Groom's contributions, embarrassed by his duties, or dismissing them as trivial. Yet this gentle dismissal risks misunderstanding history itself, which isn't merely composed of grand battles, sweeping treaties, or dramatic revolutions. History also includes mundane routines, embarrassing moments, and quiet intimacies, all shaping human lives in subtle yet powerful ways. The Groom of the Stool reminds us to embrace history's complexities, contradictions, and subtle truths. His role gently challenges simplistic narratives about royalty, dignity, and human experience, revealing nuanced layers often hidden beneath surface appearances. By exploring his story, we gain fresh insights into the past, insights both uncomfortable and enlightening. Yet, even more profoundly, the Groom's legacy quietly invites empathy. It reminds us that behind every historical figure, however grand or powerful, lies ordinary human vulnerability. Kings, queens, nobles, and commoners all shared basic needs, fears, and embarrassments. Recognizing this common humanity fosters deeper understanding across centuries, bridging historical divides with quiet compassion. Perhaps that is the Groom's greatest historical gift, gently teaching us empathy. His quiet, intimate service reminds us that dignity lies not in titles, power, or privilege, but in shared human experiences, vulnerabilities, and kindnesses. Even the most powerful monarch required quiet compassion, discreet support, and gentle care. The Groom's role, however awkward, embodied precisely this quiet humanity. Tonight, as our journey concludes, let's gently reflect on what the Groom of the Stool can teach us today. In a world often defined by power struggles, public appearances, and superficial dignity, perhaps his legacy quietly urges us to embrace humility, compassion, and authenticity. Even the most embarrassing or awkward experiences deserve acknowledgement and empathy, not shame or ridicule. Moreover, the Groom reminds us to look beneath appearances, gently uncovering deeper historical truths. Behind royal grandeur lay ordinary humanity. Beneath political power lay quiet vulnerabilities. Recognizing these layers enriches historical understanding, fostering nuanced perspectives rather than simplistic judgments. As historians continue exploring the Groom's legacy, through research, exhibitions, and popular media, his role will continue gently provoking reflection, debate, and empathy. Each new discovery adds subtle nuance, gently deepening appreciation for his quiet contributions. And though his duties themselves have vanished, his symbolic legacy endures, quietly shaping how we understand power, intimacy, and dignity itself. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine the Groom standing quietly behind history's velvet curtain, holding scented towels and whispered secrets. He gently invites us to reflect on vulnerability, humility, and shared humanity, qualities timelessly relevant even today. His role, though awkward or embarrassing, offers powerful lessons about compassion, authenticity, and historical complexity. So sleep peacefully, comforted by gentle reminders that history's hidden truths, however mundane or uncomfortable, offer profound insights, quiet wisdom, and timeless empathy. The Groom of the Stool quietly embodies precisely these qualities, gently reminding us of history's complexities, contradictions, and subtle humanity. Now, let's gently ease toward rest, softening our thoughts and lengthening our breaths. Our journey tonight, though strange and amusing, has revealed quiet truths worth remembering. History is never simple, always nuanced, forever inviting gentle curiosity and compassion. As your eyes grow heavy, let these insights gently soothe you, reassuring you that beneath every historical tale lies ordinary humanity, quiet dignity, and timeless empathy. Tomorrow's dawn will gently awaken fresh curiosity and thoughtful reflection, but tonight, rest softly in history's comforting embrace, knowing you've explored a hidden corner of the past with kindness, openness, and gentle wonder. Sleep peacefully, dear listener. Sweet dreams.